Добрый день, я приветствую вас.
Good afternoon. I welcome you in the hall of the press conferences of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation for our weekly briefing. Joining us are Russian and foreign journalists. I am sorry for the delay. We had a great deal of urgent news that required preparation in order to present our reaction on the international agenda. Today, I would like to begin with two important dates. One of them has become a tradition. The other one will only become one. The first one. We have already talked in detail on the anniversary of the return of Crimea and Sevastopol to Russia. We talked about this during the previous briefing, and today I would like to say once again that back on March 18th, 2014, the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, signed a decree to accept two new regions into Russia, the Republic of Crimea and Sevastopol. This is an official holiday in Crimea, the day of reunification with Russia, the day of the return of Sevastopol to Russia. Let me remind you that this historic step became a result of the free expression of the will on the referendum on March 16, 2014, during which the people of Crimea and Sevastopol took the decision and expressed their lawful will and made the only right and confident choice to move further with Russia. And the results are apparent to everyone. 96.7% of the voters in Crimea and 99.5% of people in Sevastopol voted to reunify with their historical motherland. These are not just figures. This is the voice of the people. This is the foundation of democracy and the democratic process. It was heard and supported by Russia, the Russian people. And now we truly stand united. This event, poetically called the Russian Spring, became a symbol of historical justice that we have fought and suffered for. And unfortunately, there is still suffering going on today due to the open hybrid war against our country. But Crimea returned home. This was a key moment of the consolidation of the Russian society. And to quote political scientists, the point of assembly for all the people, the entire nation. We showed the world the unbending will of the people to defend their roots, their history, their identity. That which we call the true traditional values. The past 12 years have become an era of the revival of the peninsula. Today's Crimea is more than just a region of the world or a unique place. This is a region of dynamic development in Russia. I sincerely congratulate all the people of Crimea and Sevastopol, all the citizens of the Russian Federation on this important occasion. We've been moving forward together, and we are proud of our common motherland. Yes, we are going through challenges. As has always been, this is our history too. We have another important day, which is coming soon. This is a new date for us, but still based on historical memory. As you know, January 1st, 2026, two laws entered into force. Federal Law 74 FZ, dated April 21st, 2025, on immortalizing the memory of the victims of the genocide of the Soviet people during the Great Patriotic War of 1941-1945, and Federal Law number 523 FZ, dated December 29, 2025, on amendments to Article 1.1 of the Federal Law on Days of Military Glory and commemorative dates in Russia. According to them, April 19th is declared the day of remembrance of the victims of the genocide of the Soviet people committed by the Nazis and their accomplices during the Great Patriotic War of 1941-1945. The choice of April 19 as this day of remembrance is tied to the fact that on this day in 1943, Decree number 39 of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR was issued. It was on measures of punishment for German fascist villains guilty of murders and tortures of the Soviet civilian population and captured Red Army soldiers, for spies, traitors to the motherland from among Soviet citizens, and for their accomplices. This was a legal assessment. It was the first time the fact of a targeted and large-scale policy by the Nazis and their accomplices to destroy the peaceful population in the occupied territory was recognized, along with the punishability of such crimes. The decree became the legal basis for further work to bring the Nazis and their accomplices to justice. It laid the legal foundations for the famous Nuremberg Tribunal, whose anniversary was celebrated a few months ago. And, of course, the subsequent trials against the Nazis and their accomplices were also based on this decree. On January 27th this year, on the day of the complete lifting of the siege of Leningrad, the Russian Prime Minister, Mr. Mikhail Mishustin, signed an order. According to it, the National Center for Historical Memory under the President of the Russian Federation was designated as the national operator to immortalize the memory of the victims of the genocide of the Soviet people during the Great Patriotic War. In 1948, the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment for the Crime of Genocide entered into force. The extermination of Jews, Roma, and Serbs during the Second World War was internationally recognized as genocide. However, the crimes of the Third Reich against the Soviet people were not limited to intentions to destroy national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups, as defined by the Convention. In their inhuman fanaticism, they went much further. The principles of state policy of the Reich, formulated in writing and systematically implemented by the Nazis on USSR territory, led to the deaths of millions of peaceful Soviet citizens. This terrifying figure far exceeded the consequences of what is called the Holocaust in Israel and the genocide of Serbs and Roma. The Nazis systematically destroyed the entire population of our country, regardless of ethnic, racial, or religious affiliation. Russians, Jews, Belarusians, Tatars, Ukrainians, Chuvars were citizens of the USSR. They lived on lands that, according to Hitler's criminal plan, were subject to ruthless Germanization. That was a direct quote, a hideous quote. Our duty to the memory of our ancestors is to prevent the forgetting of crimes without a statute of limitations. But not only that, modern governments of countries that directly participated in the greatest tragedy of mankind, the Second World War, do not hesitate to draw an equal sign between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Imagine that. They place the Nazi swastika and the Red Star on the same level, the Red Star and the Red Banner that defeated Nazism. And now they are putting an equal sign to the symbols of the Third Reich. Therefore, it is especially important in modern realities, filled with such false interpretations, to correctly name what happened then and prevent the distortion or falsification of meanings and senses. Modern historians have calculated how many peaceful Soviet citizens became victims of the ruthless Nazi extermination policy. By the most conservative estimates and the verified historical estimates, the figure is striking: 13.7 million people. This figure is made up of archival data, witness testimonies, and accounting of thousands of mass graves in the liberated occupied territory. It is proven that at least 7.4 million peaceful Soviet residents were deliberately killed, shot, burned, and just think about it, buried alive. Penal labor in concentration camps and inhuman treatment led to the painful deaths of another 2 million people and more. Among those driven to forced labor in Germany, more than 1 million children and teenagers were placed in concentration camps. According to the idea of the Third Reich's top brass, Most children from the USSR were meant to be destroyed. They became forced blood donors, biological raw material, minor slaves, and human shields during military operations. Among the residents of the occupied territories, over 4 million more people died prematurely. They died from the overall deterioration of living conditions, diseases, and hunger. But this figure, 13.7 million people, does not include all the victims of Hitler's regime's crimes. As a result of the largest war crime in history, the siege of Leningrad, at least 1 million people died. Every year, we learn more and more names of the victims. We compile the new figure, the number of victims of that atrocious act committed by the Nazis against a peaceful city. Hundreds of thousands of peaceful citizens were killed by bombings in Sevastopol and Odessa, Kerch and Novorossiysk, Smolensk and Tula, Murmansk, Kharkov, Minsk on August 23, 1942, even before the German troops broke through, before the legendary battle began, during a massive raid by German aviation in Stalingrad. In just one day, from 40 to 70,000 civilians died. One of the most beautiful, peaceful cities of the Soviet Union was turned into ruins. Can Soviet prisoners of war who died in Hitler's camps also be considered victims of the genocide staged by the Nazis? The Hitlerites deliberately, through exhaustion and torture, exterminated about 3 million and more than 3.1 million Soviet prisoners of war to be exact, about 60% of their total number. Meanwhile, the mortality rate of Allied soldiers, US, Britain, France, who ended up in German captivity was recorded at a completely different level, 3 to 4%. Demographers determined the total population loss of the USSR during the Great Patriotic War, according to various estimates, at 30 to 40 million people. This is the number from which we should start calculating the real losses. The scale of the tragedy is unthinkable. This is the number that we should use for the real calculations to learn of the real scale of the genocide of the Soviet people. The echo of war sounded over our country for a long time. Indirect losses, unformed families, unborn children, premature deaths from diseases and wounds. Who will count them? And now the soldiers of the Red Army, who liberated Europe and the whole world from fascism, back in the middle of the 20th century, are now excluded from the ranks of the victors. They do not talk about those who made a decisive contribution to the defeat of the Brown Plague. They rename streets, tear down monuments, dig up graves. And some go even further. They blame the USSR for starting the war. Apparently, our guilt is that the Soviet Union, contrary perhaps to someone's expectations and plans, survived, even though it suffered losses unprecedented in history. We survived and became not another victim, but a victor nation. But this does not cancel the fact of the genocide of the Soviet people in any way. This day is coming soon, April 19th, remember that, and let us do our best. Each and every one of us, and trust me, much depends on us, to make sure this is not yet another day. We should make this day noticed and noticeable in schools, in universities, in your offices, and this should be covered by the mass media. Share the stories. Fill this day with stories, facts, figures. Trust me, this is an important day for our historical calendar. Sure, we have the 22nd of June a day of memory and sorrow. We bow down our heads on this day. We have the 9th of May, when we honor the heroes and congratulate each other on the fact that our country still stands. But this day, April 19th, is the day when we must remember what they wanted to do with us. And unfortunately, what they did against millions of citizens of the Soviet Union. They were deliberately killing our citizens under the sole guise and the sole pretext and explanation. The sole reason was that, according to the ruling elites of Central Europe, these people were not meant to exist. Now moving on to the traditional scheduling, the minister's schedule. On March 24th, a meeting of the Board of Trustees of the Gorchakov Fund for Public Diplomacy Support will take place. It will be chaired by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. The participants will review the results of activities in 2025 and approve work directions for 2027. The fund was created, let me remind you, in 2010 by an order of the Russian president. Its goal is to support public diplomacy, help the domestic non-governmental sector participate in international cooperation, and involve its institutions in the foreign policy process. Every year, under its auspices, scientific and educational programs are held for young international policy and international relations experts from Russia, the CIS, and other states. It assists in organizing conferences, roundtables, and expert meetings. This includes conveying Russian approaches to key global policy issues to foreign partners. And on April 8th of this year, in the reception house of the Russian Foreign Ministry, under the MFA chairmanship, the 46th meeting of the Council of Heads of Russian Regions will take place, chaired by the minister, governors, senior staff of the Russian presidential administration, and federal executive bodies will take part in it. The main topic on the agenda is strengthening cooperation between Russian regions and partners from Africa. During the meeting, a report will be heard from the head of the Council's working group, Astrakhan Region Governor, Mr. Igor Babushkin. Recommendations will also be adopted to boost regional activities in this direction. In addition, there are plans to hear an informational report by Amur Region Governor Vasily Orlov. He will speak about the federal-level competence center for Russian-Chinese cooperation in Blagoveshchensk as a tool for interaction between Russian and Chinese regions. Now moving on to the current international agenda. We are deeply concerned by the non-stop military struggle between our friendly nations, Pakistan and Afghanistan, bringing tragic consequences, including for the civilian population. A new tragic episode was an airstrike, as a result of which in Kabul on the evening of March 16th, according to media reports, a rehabilitation center for drug addicts was destroyed. There are numerous victims, according to reports. 400 people died, 240 civilians were injured. Expressing deep condolences to the relatives of the deceased, we again urgently called on Islamabad and Kabul to abandon the dead-end course for confrontation and resolve differences through political and diplomatic means. Moving on to the situation in the Middle East.
As you know, regularly, practically daily, we comment on the issue with relevant messages and with the statements of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and in detail this situation on a regular basis is being assessed and commented publicly by the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, His Excellency Mr. Sergei Lavrov, which is why, in line with this, I would like to focus specifically on the important aspects. And of course, undoubtedly, with the geographical and political aspect, but that also have to do with the trade markets, on the energy aspects, and of course on ecology. That is supposedly being discussed so much, but right now we would like to look at it through the prism of actual figures and the processes that will be developed in the near future, because the aggravation of the situation, if we can still refer to it, a real tragedy in the Middle East, near the Persian Gulf, has additional negative spaces. First, it's the largest oil-carrying region. The Middle Eastern states are one of the key producers and suppliers of energy resources. According to the International Energy Agency, Persian Gulf states supply around a third of world volume of oil and around 40% of gas. And for the Hormuz Gulf, there is about a fifth part of all oil and about 30% of the LNG. This concentration of resources and routes makes the world market affectable in light of the destabilization of the situation in the region, which directly threatens the global energy security. Just look at how often it was discussed and continues to be discussed. The Middle East conflict put the energy markets in the situation of turbulence and imposed great damages to the world economy. Analytical researchers of leading investment companies all agree that daily consumers do not receive additional 15 million barrels of oil and 4.5 million barrels of oil products. Around 20% of the supplies of LNG have already been withdrawn from the markets, and according to the estimates, the global export of LNG has lowered by 219,000 tons per day, which is about the fifth of daily world consumption of methanol. Could be facing the deficit about 18 million tons per year, according to the experts. With 30-day lowering of supplies, the price of oil could be stabilized about $76 per barrel. And these are the most common estimates. And if we are facing a 2-month lowering of supplies, $93 per barrel. After the prolongation of conflict, the prices could surge up to $150 or $200 per barrel. Raising the prices by $10, and this is why it's important, will directly affect everyone, will lower the world GDP by 0.1%, and raising the oil prices to $125 will lead to the recession of European economics. Strictly speaking, the scope of consequences for the global economy will depend on the longevity and the intensity of the conflict. The world energy markets responded to the Middle Eastern conflict, and in the first 2 weeks, the oil prices has changed rapidly, and the peak on March 9th reached $120 per barrel. Right now, it's continuing to stay above $100 per barrel. As for March 17th, $104.08, and the markets have always responded to any Middle East instability. Just remember July 4th, 2008, when the oil reached the historical maximum, $143.95 per barrel. In the first day of the military actions, the price of April futures of oil on the European markets has surged almost by 25%. As for now, the situation continues to be unstable and is going around $600 for 1,000 cubic meters. Now let's look at how this situation has affected the insurance companies. They've raised the damages price as well as introduced new additions. The price of insuring a ship in the Persian Gulf has surged 6 times in comparison with February 27th, and is now going around $200,000 to $500,000 per day. Can you imagine that? In order to counter the further destabilization of energy markets, 32 countries of the International Energy Agency have decided to liberate 400 million barrels of oil from strategic reserves. Other than that, the U.S. also intend to liberate from the reserves 172 million barrels of black gold. Although, according to different estimates, this volume of new oil could cover barely 25 days of traffic through that Gulf. We can't forget to mention another issue that's been created by the aggressive actions by the US and Israel aggression against Iran and the destabilization of the region as a whole since the military actions have begun in the Middle East. The products markets have responded by raising prices for fertilizers and their components, and the prices are due to the risk of full blocking of the Hormuz Gulf. As the countries are huge producers and exporters of these products, this transport corridor is responsible for around 30% of all fertilizers, and the situation is aggravated by the seasonal demand and the surge of prices for the natural gas used for the nitrogen fertilizers. And the approximate surge of prices has already gone above 20%, and the prices in Asia for carbamide have already reached $700 per ton, which is the maximum for the last 3.5 years. Perhaps you have missed something, but it seems we all have missed something. Where are the statements of different kinds of human rights organizations? These kinds, such as product security, fertilizers prices surge. This cannot be viewed solely differentiated from human rights. These are precisely the human rights that they seemed so concerned about. But it seems that the West only sees the human rights as the right to change sex, and everything else they are forgetting about. So all the human rights institutes or institutions in the West should be ringing all the bells and ringing all the alarms. They should be on high alert and should be drawing the attention of the international community as a whole, so that every country with huge economic issues that existed before that, the poorest countries where people are dying of starvation, of illnesses, where people are fighting for the simple right to access to clean water or any kind of food. Where is everyone? I believe human rights are in the exact same place where they have been witnessing the murdering of children in Donbass for many years, but we will speak more on that later on. The grain prices are showcasing a more stable dynamic of price growth, around 3-5%, but that's for countries with quite stable economy and agriculture. So these are the figures that are in a limited range of price surge. But what about the poorest countries? Due to the rise of prices for energy carriers, new prices for logistics, in the nearest time we could be facing raised prices for basic products, food. Experts are stating that we could see 50% less of harvest, which could surge a new global food inflation. In the long-term perspective, due to the shortages of agrochemical production, the losses could lead to about 0.5 to 2% of global GDP, which is equal to the losses of half to $2 trillion of US dollars. And I cannot forget to mention that the aggression of the Israeli armed forces in the US against Iran is also affecting the environment. So where is everyone who for 15 or 20 years non-stop have built their campaigns on the ecological agenda? Suddenly they're silent. Military equipments carry heavy chemicals, different kinds of chemical, as well as other toxics, the dioxides of serum and the nitrogens, which spoils the soil. And those are not facts taken out of context. It's all affecting the health of population, as well as products and everything else. Remains of destroyed buildings on the territories of Iran due to bombardments will be a serious ecological issue for decades ahead. The layer that has been formed from the products of explosion and the oil burning, from the destroyed military equipment and military reserves, all kinds of trash will lead to the greenhouse exposure as well as the dirty waters. And it will not just affect Iran, but the whole region. And unfortunately, the strikes on the object of energy infrastructures is a routine. And as many have assumed, is a normal thing during the military conflict. But when it comes to Iran, they're also affecting the oil reserves located very close to the heavily populated capital, which has led to the largest affection of the reservoirs in Tehran, which led to the black rain. Usually, rain washes away all the dirt, but in this case, it just aggravated the situation. All the toxic chemicals that have been mixed with water are even more toxic, and coming into contact with them could affect terribly the health care of all those affected, of children as well. Where's everyone? Where's UNICEF? Where all the human rights activists, child human rights activists, who ran around, speaking of Syrian boys, blaming all those who were not responsible for that. The WHO is fixating the degradation of the healthcare and ecological situation in the region, leading to the growth of respiratory diseases affecting eyes and skin due to a lot of toxic chemicals affecting soil, water, and food. There is lack of access to quality healthcare, according to the WHO from 28th of February this year. They have launched strikes against 18 healthcare institutions in Iran, which led to the death of 8 healthcare officials in Lebanon, which led to serious interruptions in the work of emergency cars. There is a huge lack of medical equipment. An additional charge is the growing migrational flows. Yes, all of that is terrifying. But add on top of that all the suffering that has been experienced by those who were in Gaza. And who was eradicated. Many tens of thousands of people fell victim to that. According to the estimates of WHO, all these facts showcase a terrible situation, creating aggravating risks for the mostly vulnerable amongst the population. So in the short-term perspective, there will be more price surges due to the lack of energy resources and the oil deficit, which is aggravating the agriculture. As the fertilizers are getting more expensive, this is creating real risks due to the lack of agricultural product in energy-dependent countries of Asia, Africa, and Europe, which could lead to the largest ecology catastrophe in the region of Persian Gulf and beyond. But our country doesn't just fixate it and draws conclusions. During the last week's briefing, due to the destruction of many hospitals and ambulance stations, and due to a lot of victims among the citizens, Iran asked our country for the supply of medical supplies, and we immediately responded to help our friends. And due to the decree of the President of the Russian Federation on March 12th, the airplane Il-76 of the Russian emergency services has delivered to the airport of the Azerbaijani city Lenkarani, which is located on the border with Iran, the first supply of humanitarian aid, around 13 tons of medical equipment. And we stand in solidarity with Iran, and we're especially grateful to the Azerbaijani side for aiding in this operation. We've always responded in time to all the messages of Tehran, which happened due to the flooding in February 2023, to the earthquake, and in May 2024, to the search and rescue operation when the helicopter of the president has crashed, and in April 2025, after the fire in the city of Bandar Abbas, and we will continue to help the friendly Iranian people that has faced so much hardship along the way. You know, I understand that right now historic memory is not just being written, but people are also suffering from short-term memory loss. And also when the education system is aimed at showcasing history even less than it used to be before. So it's difficult to understand history, and for those who believe that this is new, that this has never happened before, or I really, quote unquote, liked the statement more. I was terrified by the statement of very short-sighted people among the Brussels bureaucratic institutions that supposedly Russia is to blame. Now we're to blame according to them. But I really like to ask them, could you at least restore the chain of events of at least 15 years that you, your countries, your international, regional organization and military blocs participated in, or that also poses a real challenge? Before placing blame on others, perhaps you should recall how you, Brussels officials, how your arms are full of blood. 15 years ago, on March 19th. Soon we will be unfortunately celebrating a horrific tragedy anniversary. On March 19th, 2011, the NATO has launched an intervention in Libya, bypassing the fundamental principles of international law. And the NATO operation, does Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas, and Beryl, how it used to be called, the Unified Protector, which led to the collapse of Libyan statehood and plunged the country to the state of chaos and anarchy for many years. And Libya still cannot recover from the actions of NATO forces to this day.
Who was this protector defending against? Who was NATO protecting the Libyans against? They were talking about it a lot, but as usual, they were talking about democracy, freedom, plurality, and so on. In reality, the NATO operation turned into indiscriminate strikes on the civilian population, the destruction of civilian infrastructure facilities, weapon supplies in violation of the embargo, the participation of Western instructors and special forces in supporting one of the warring sides in an internal conflict. This is what the NATO allies were actually doing in Libya. They simply destroyed the country and then left it to its fate. Unfortunately, there is nothing surprising here. It is worth noting that NATO member states act this way everywhere they appear. One can recall together, for example, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Did anyone bear any responsibility for this? You know the answer is no. Now they keep running around, seeking some accusation against Russia or coming up with yet another tribunal or yet another warrant. At least 1 million peaceful Iraqis were killed. 1 million is only the calculation of the civilians done by the NGOs. Perhaps someone could file a claim or issue an arrest warrant against those who committed the aggression in Iraq. Perhaps they will pay some compensation to the Iraqis or the Libyans. No. Just in the period from the start of the Unified Protector Operation, the NATO aggression against Libya, to the end of May 2011 as a result of alliance airstrikes on Libyan territory, 718 people died and 4,067 people were injured. These are civilians. There are also documented facts of NATO crimes against the civilian population. Some of them were even reflected in reports by several authoritative international structures and NGOs, including the final report of the International Commission of Inquiry, presented at the 19th session of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva in March 2012. So what? These are mere words for them. And motivation for new crimes. One of the most resonant episodes was a series of rocket and bomb strikes by Alliance air forces on 2 so-called former agricultural buildings in the area of the Naljar settlement near the city of Scythian. As a result, 85 people became victims, including 33 children. NATO Press Service representative Mr. Lavoie declared that the strike on these targets, not even people, was of an absolutely legitimate nature. The armed NATO operation against sovereign Libya 15 years ago became a tragedy, the long-term and multifaceted consequences of which are felt to this day. Today, the price of the Libyan conflict in monetary terms alone is approximately $1 trillion. As for the losses among the peaceful population of the country plunged into the abyss of multi-year destructive internal civil crisis, no one has even tried to calculate them. And the deaths of the people come after money for the sole reason, because this is an appeal to the Westerners. They only understand the language of money. The people and their lives, the fates of children, mean nothing to them. And now yet another example of what they committed in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf, in different parts of the world. They do the same in the central of Europe, the Ukrainian crisis. They are increasing targeted rocket and drone strikes on civilian objects, residential buildings, medical and educational institutions, civil and social enterprises. Their topics are all the same. The armed forces of Ukraine keep increasing their strikes. But who are those who target the strikes? Who are those who oversee them? These are the same people who are now committing crimes in the zone of the Persian Gulf. Over the past week, over 240 people were injured, including 6 children. 30 people died. Moving through the regions, Belgorod region from March 12th to 15th, several municipalities of the region survived drone attacks at once. About 20 people were injured on the night of March 15th. Bandera followers again subjected Belgorod and the Belgorod region to a massive rocket attack using Western types of weapons. This time, at least 12 units of American HIMARS MLRS were used. DPR on March 14 in Avdiivka, the Isnovatsky district, as a result of an explosive device detonation while on duty. Employees of the 82nd Fire and Rescue Unit of the city of Yasinovatia were injured. The squad commander died. 3 more rescuers received injuries. Zaporozhye region on March 13, as a result of a UAV strike in the Melitopol district of the Svetodolinskaya-Fedorovka railway stretch, a locomotive was damaged. 2 employees of the Novorossiya Railways enterprise died. 2 more civilians received injuries due to drone attacks in the city of Dnepropetrovsk and near the village of Podgorny, Krasnodar territory. On March 14th, a Ukrainian airplane-type drone attacked the Kavkaz port in the Temryuk district. 2 civilians were injured. Kursk region on March 11th, on the Dyakonovo-Sudzha highway. A foreign volunteer, a citizen of the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, died from a Ukrainian drone strike. On March 15th, due to the use of enemy UAVs, 7 people were injured. Kherson region on March 12th in Novaya Kakhovka. A civilian passenger car was damaged as a result of a UAV attack. 5 civilians were injured. And they shall be punished for that. And this is what we're doing today, right now. Apart from the punishment that they get on the battlefield, there is also work by the Russian law enforcement agencies and courts. They continue to take measures to bring Ukrainian militants and foreign mercenaries to criminal liability. A sentence in absentia of 28 years of deprivation of liberty for participating in combat actions on the side of the AFU was handed down to Georgian citizens as a Shonia. 6 Ukrainian militants, Sergei Velichko, Konstantin Nemechev, Vitaly Posakhov, Artyom Subachev, Andrei Ingalenko, and Sergei Ingalenko, was sentenced in absentia to life imprisonment. In March 2022, in the Kharkov region, they shot Russian prisoners of war. The commander of the AFU, Brigade Nikolai Дзyamin, who gave a criminal order in January 2024 to shoot down a Russian plane carrying Ukrainian prisoners of war in the Belgorod region using an American Patriot complex, was sentenced by a court in absentia to life imprisonment. Although I am not sure that he is still on this earth in Ukraine, since he gave an order to shoot down an aircraft carrying Ukrainian prisoners of war. Previously, Dzyamin was already convicted in absentia for organizing a terrorist act by launching a rocket strike on February 23, 2024 on the Trudovaya Armenia hamlet in the Kanevskoye district of the Krasnodar territory, which resulted in 10 deaths. Sentences of deprivation of liberty for a term of 15 to 18 years were handed down against Ukrainian militants Alexander Garbus, Alexander Sychugov, Nikolai Chaban, Vladimir Koshmel, and Sergei Mekhanoshin for committing a terrorist act in the Kursk region. Charges for committing a terrorist attack in the Kursk region were brought against militants of the 103rd Separate Territorial Defense Brigade of the AFU, Evgeny Shapoval and Yuri Levkov, as well as Vladimir Sirokov of the 41st Separate Mechanized Brigade of the AFU. Take a look at all these crimes. They're like carbon copies of each other. Recently, we obtained proof that the Kiev regime, citing a lack of weaponry for the AFU, literally trades it, traffics it, left and right. Every third automatic rifle used by the extremist and terrorist groups in the world are of, drum roll, Ukrainian origin. Over 70% of all the weapons used by the new generation Jalisco Mexican drug cartel were originally meant for the AFU. Ukraine is turning into the largest international hub for weapon leakage, for black market weapon traffic, which creates serious risks for global security. And yet, Bankova is still in search of sponsors. The Kiev regime continues to look for ways to receive free financial assistance from its sponsors and benefactors, this time under the pretext of modernizing Ukraine's energy grid, strengthening infrastructure protection and restoring it. They plan to wring 5 billion euros out of the Europeans. The newly appointed Minister of Energy of the country, Mr. Shmyhal, has already announced the urgent convening of the so-called Energy Ramstein meeting. Whether the raised funds will go to the stated goals is a rhetorical question. It is enough to recall the sensational Operation Midas conducted by the US-supervised National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine and a specialized anti-corruption prosecutor's office. As a result of their investigation at the end of 2025, let me remind you, billion-dollar thefts, including of Western aid, were uncovered right in the energy sector. So what? Are they trying to fill in the gaps left by the corruption? Back then, the traces led directly to the ministers and the inner circle of Zelensky. The question is whether their resignation led to any prosecution or any legal consequences. Of course it did not. The Verkhovna Rada is actively discussing measures of pressure on citizens who do not want, for unclear reasons, to go to certain death, as well as on those who have gone AWOL from military units. This involves blocking their phones, bank cards, as well as limiting other civil liberties outside of judicial procedures. Moreover, A plan is being prepared to tighten mobilization, providing for lowering of its threshold for women. They will increasingly be drawn into participation in combat actions. A lowering of the mobilization age among men is also actively discussed. In Kiev, they also do not abandon the task of increasing the number of contract soldiers. Corresponding legislative work is underway for these purposes. Those wishing to join the AFU for money are promised additional social, economic, educational, pension, and guarantees. This is the most ridiculous point. You're well aware that these manhunters who stuff people into their vans, they literally take them to their guaranteed pension, which they will never see. They will only get the burial money, not the pensions. But they clearly do not add attractiveness to army service. On the contrary. Otherwise there would be no shortage of such volunteers, but now they are only forced to seek people. On Bankova, they strive to compensate the lack of internal resources by attracting and redistributing foreign mercenaries. Strictly on paper, certain improved conditions are created for them. Formally, the issue of the procedure for service in the AFU for foreigners and stateless persons in officer positions is being worked out for them and their family members since January 16 this year. The procedure for acquiring Ukrainian citizenship has been simplified. On May 10th, a law dated December 17, 2025 is due to come into force, according to which foreigners will be mandatorily documented with a temporary residence certificate, a kind of bait for receiving social and administrative services. It is clear that this Kiev regime clique is not going to fulfill its social obligations to the militants, guided by the reluctance to pay compensation to the families of the dead. The AFU command recently issued an order banning the collection of DNA materials of the dead. Why? To make sure that Ukrainians' mothers and widows, sisters and children never find their loved ones, in order not to pay them. Bankova and this hellish clique is unwilling to spend money. They don't want to ruin the last statistics stated by Zelensky. Supposedly, just over 50,000 people over all the years of the conflict. Who is going to believe that? Who? Nobody believes that. Everybody knows that Zelensky is lying. There is only one question. How is this possible? What is in the head of this so-called ruler? Just a cold calculation in the matter of eliminating Ukrainians. This is Zelensky's main goal. Take a look. There is no other way. They hate everybody. They hate their friends and foes alike. They hate the citizens of Ukraine. They terribly hate the citizens of Ukraine who ask questions, who are unwilling to die. Zelensky hates them. He hates the Russians, all the Russian people of various nationalities and ethnicities. Surprisingly enough, he doesn't hate those who sponsor him. And yet there are threats from him against those whose boots he was licking very recently. On March 14th, Zelensky introduced personal sanctions against those who he also hates, in addition to those who he already hated, the 10 Russian Paralympic athletes, the Paralympians, who, in his opinion, I quote, spread Russian propaganda and took part. Just imagine that. Took part in the aggressive war of conquest. The Paralympians, according to him. Oh my God, how long will these increased bastards keep punishing the people. Bankova and the Kiev regime don't just harbor hatred for Russia, they harbor hatred for everyone. This is what they truly feel. This is not honorable rage, otherwise they wouldn't be hitting against their own. They would have some sympathy for their own people, their own citizens. These restrictions were introduced against the backdrop of the successful performance of Russian athletes at the 2026 Winter Paralympic Games in Italy. We sincerely congratulate them on their victories. We were asked to make a comment on their performances. There's only one word: a heroic deed. Apparently, Zelensky simply could not come to terms with the fact that the Russian team, being the smallest in number, performed beyond all praise and took an honorable third place in the medal standings. After everything our athletes went through, it started much earlier than 2022, and they took the honorable third place. They overtook dozens of other countries whose national teams had a much larger number of athletes. And those teams have never faced the persecution faced by our athletes. By the way, in the entire history of the Paralympics, no state except Russia managed to get into the top 3 with such a limited number of participants. These people are called people with disabilities. But now our Paralympians truly show that their abilities are limitless. Perhaps the Russian anthem made Zelensky quite nervous. Thanks to the efforts of our athletes, it played victoriously on the Alpine slopes 8 whole times. The only thing they were capable of in Ukraine was to try again to politicize the sports festival and boycott the opening and closing ceremonies of the Paralympics due to the participation of the Russian and Belarusian national teams, and then, out of impotent anger, introduced restrictions against those who did not even compete at the Games. By the way, in Kiev they did not bother to pay tribute to their own Paralympians, the Ukrainian Paralympians, who showed a worthy result, by the way. But they went all out, searching and pulling out of thin air ways to take revenge on the Russian Paralympic movement for sports victories in Milan. The result? The Bandera Eye felt on the laureates of the Sports Award, Heroes of Our Time, established by the Russian Paralympic Committee and the Healthy Fatherland movement. That's right. Zelensky, seek your own Paralympians and give them awards, congratulate them.
Remember people. But what are we talking about? They have no time for that. They're trying to fight the Russian language. They're not fighting for life, but for death. But the Russian language will stand victorious no matter what. You know, the Alexander Pushkin, whom the Bandera regime is stubbornly trying to ban, wrote, "Oh, how many marvelous discoveries the spirit of enlightenment has in store for us." He wrote that on the spirit of enlightenment, but here, this spirit is the stolen one, the Nazi one, is the exact opposite of the spirit of enlightenment, is the spirit of nihilism, of lack of faith, of lack of science, of lack of education, of being so deep into this nationalism. It's not a spirit, but it's a malicious spirit. And this is the discovery that we're witnessing today. And this quote-unquote discovery was made by the Commissioner for the Protection of the Ukrainian Language, Elena Ivanovskaya. Please continue to speak. Your quotes are so useful for us. And I would like to state that. And the quotes of Elena Ivanovskaya are so wide that even the Black Sea fades in comparison. And no matter what I've read, they've said a lot about the Black Sea as well. So let's move on to the quote of Elena Ivanovskaya, who relentlessly is fighting like hell the Russian language, who's very concerned that Ukrainians pick up Russian so easily, and that after interacting with Russian-speaking peers, children in Lvov readily switch to the great and mighty language. And what do you think? Elena Ivanovskaya decided to find a non-trivial explanation for this. And I believe she was successful in that. She did not find an ordinary explanation. I don't believe it has anything to do with science, perhaps with some pseudoscience. And perhaps there could be a simple explanation, a scientific one, that Russian is the native language of the majority of Ukraine's inhabitants. No, she did not even recall that, nor the fact that Russian and Ukrainian belong to the same language group or have much in common. No. That's of no interest to her. She has groundbreaking data, and I have no idea what kind of laboratory produces such data. But allow me to repeat that I adore Elena Ivanovskaya and her quotes. This is a quote from her interview to Ukraine's Channel 5. Direct quote. Please just hear and enjoy. The Russian language, according to Elena Ivanovskaya, is synonymous with arrogance and with a certain haughtiness. Because, have you noticed, for example, she asks, such pattern? We really do pick up Russian easily. Russian-speaking children move to Lvov, notes Madame Ivanovskaya, and the children of Lvov start speaking Russian, not the other way around. She goes on. Perhaps she should have stopped then, but no, she continues. Usually, when these Russian speakers, she no longer refers to them as children or human. No, but she follows Zelensky's agenda that those are not even humans. When these Russian speakers appear among our children, they position themselves with arrogance in a language of power. I'm just curious. Russian-speaking children, are those not children of her own country? Are those children who have been dropped in Lvov? Perhaps those are Ukrainian citizens. Perhaps their parents are Ukrainian citizens, or those children are Ukrainian citizens. Just think about it. When these Russian speakers appear among our children, as she says, and so on. So now she separates children based on their language, not even based on their citizenship, but on what language they're speaking, based on what children are theirs and what not. And what if those are bilingual children? What if it's a child who speaks 2 languages, or God forbid 3 languages? What would happen to Elena Ivanovskaya? But according to her quotes, something has already happened to her. And then she goes on. And when there is a language of power, everyone else submits. The Russian language, she goes on, has a vertical structure. The Ukrainian language, she continues, has a horizontal structure. End of quote. I don't know, either she says that you do not kick lion dog, or she asks for the capitulation, or something else. I am at a loss. But such anti-scientific nonsense can only be explained by primitive nationalism in need of denazification, because it's borderline Nazification. There's no doubt that the policy of Ukrainianization has not just failed because it was unsuccessful, it has officially stricken the Ukrainian people itself, which lived and used Ukrainian, Russian, and Sorjak for communication without separating those. And later on, due to their life conditions, there would be a place for each language. It would find its place in each region. It would be protected, which the international law required and which Ukraine signed. It would be regulated under the law with the languages of minorities or majorities, but it would be natural. But they had to act fast as long as they received as much money as possible to do anything so that they would receive even more money. And the first victims of those experiments were Ukrainian citizens of different nationalities. And Ukrainian citizens, despite bans and harassment from... And it's not just about fines, prison sentences, or physical harassment. People of Ukraine switched to their native language at the first opportunity, and that's Russian. It's being used more and more, and young people are increasingly using it to communicate. And this is acknowledged even by this Sprachenführer, Elena Ivanovskaya, who's attempting to use such fabrications to cover up the failure of the Bandera authorities' inhumane experiment to forcibly alter the linguistic identity of its own citizens. You know, Hitler conducted such experiments against others. Zelensky is conducting these experiments against his own citizens. Truly astonishing story. This does not excuse Hitler in any way, but this is a direct accusation of Zelensky and his clique by literally multiplying and over-multiplying the kind of evil that was produced in the Third Reich, this Nazi nature. All the above facts and many of what we speak about confirm the urgency of the tasks of denazifying and demilitarizing Ukraine and eliminating the threats emanating from its territory, and all these objectives will certainly be achieved, as we've repeatedly stated. And now about Bucha, because just 2 days ago we celebrated this date, March 16th, ahead of the anniversary of the Bucha events. The Council of Europe has introduced another portion of sanctions against Russian citizens allegedly involved in war crimes committed in this locality. And it seems that against the backdrop of the worsening socioeconomic problems caused, including by the short-sighted and frankly Russophobic policy of the European Union, which is frankly silly, sanction and fakes remain the only export goods. Stable growth of production of which is only able to be provided by the current EU leadership. It is quite expected within the framework of the next already 20th sanctions package. All this mockery is against common sense is taking place, and this is already beginning to resemble some kind of crazy ritual, where all the participants are well aware of its complete detachment from real life, yet continue to repeat them stubbornly. And recently on our resources, we published another address and other materials drawing attention to what happened in Bucha, what actually happened there. We do it regularly. We've compiled a list of leaders and ministers of foreign affairs of a number of states as well as heads of international organizations who visited the settlement of Bucha. to once again, in some way, become part of this political ritual. They were well aware where they were going. They understood it was fake, it was staged, and yet they had to participate in it. Naturally, there are a significant number of representatives of Western countries. Some of these politicians still hold their positions. And all of them disciplinedly participated in a performance directed by Kiev, which was definitely on someone's tip. And the only purpose of it was to give at least some credibility to a rather clumsy fake about mass murders in Bucha. What was the goal? It was not just to blame Russia once again, but to also undermine the negotiations that were being conducted in 2022 and that had a real chance. But for some reason, when it comes not to fictional but real crimes, whether it's a strike to the primary school in Iran, or the death of civilians, including children in Lebanon or the Gaza Strip, how many thousands of children fell victim to those? The desire to visit the scene of the tragedy, or at least raise the issue of the admissibility of such actions among Westerners, does not even arise. Needless to say, we will never see any of the politicians presented on the list of the Alley of Angels in Donetsk, where captured in granite are not just the names, but also the circumstances of death of more than 130 children. They should be brought there, even if it by brute force. But they continue to turn a blind eye to it. How much material was published, and they cannot look at it, but they have to. They will neither have mourning icons in the accounts of Hollywood stars nor highlighting of sites in European capitals. Films that tell about the tragic fate of Donetsk, Iranian or Palestinian children who became victims of war crimes will not receive an Oscar or even a wide distribution in Western countries or in any countries controlled by them. None of the representatives of the Western elites, who so like to speak about various kinds of reliability of historical tragedies, for example, about the Clooney couples, the often mentioned tragedies, how we should separate real stuff from fake, how we should not forget the truth. They will not remember the anniversary of the Songme massacre, March 16th, 1968, a proven war crime when the Vietnamese village of Songme in the province of Quang Ngai was burned by American soldiers along with the people to the last house and barn. It's the Vietnamese Hatin. For them, all that simply does not exist. We're witnessing a paradoxical situation, how the Western elites did not notice thousands of victims of armed conflicts going on right here, right now, in real time. But with some pagan fever, they visit Bucha, which for all clear, conscious, sober-minded people has long become a synonym for absolutely unprincipled lies. The special cynicism associated with this whole story emphasizes the fact that the very staging of the so-called Bucha massacre, as they like to call it, was literally copied to the smallest detail from the well-known propaganda operation of the Third Reich, which we have repeatedly talked about. And we will add the links to today's briefing text. And Bankovskaya imitate their idols from Nazi Germany with such fever to a maniacal degree. And I'll remind you of the details of this change. In October 1944, of the withdrawal from the German city of Nimmensdorf, Goebbels' department composed a story about allegedly mass murders of civilians by the Soviet military personnel that supposedly took place. In order to legitimize this propaganda and the widespread Völkischer Beobachter fake, they invited representatives of the Nazi-controlled puppet government of Estonia to the city. Supposedly, they have access to that government at hand at any time. And the representatives were supposed to give the investigation the status of international just by their mere presence. Doesn't that remind you of anything? After the opening of archives and the study of all documents, it has officially been recognized, including all at the level of the German Foreign Ministry that there were no mass murders in Nummersdorf on behalf of the Red Army. I'm convinced that in time the same thing will happen with the staging in Bucha. And what then will all those politicians, cultural figures, and representatives of international organizations look like? The list of which we published. What will they say then? And we will remind them that they participated in these hellish rituals. I would like to say a few words that unfortunately is also tied to Ukraine. Some of the actions in the Korean Republic were closely following the plans of the Republic of Korea regarding NATO initiative on the so-called list of priority needs of Ukraine. According to media reports, the possible accession to it is being worked out by South Korean agencies. It is noteworthy that relevant information flow appeared against the backdrop of deepening Seoul's dialogue with NATO, including at the highest level. Military technical cooperation of the Republic of Korea with the member states of the North Atlantic Alliance is being intensified, and within the framework of this activity, not only the rearmament of the eastern flank of NATO is carried out, but also Kyiv regime is actually indirectly fed with lethal weapons. This is due to the supply and localization of production of South Korean offensive weapons and military equipment, including artillery systems and missile defense systems, in a number of Eastern European countries. We also closely monitor and take into account this activity of Seoul. Russia's principal position on this issue was clearly and comprehensively brought to the South Korean side through diplomatic channels, and we operate based on the fact that the government of the Republic of Korea understands it well. We expect that Seoul will continue to adhere to a restrained approach in line with its assurances of non-participation in the supply of lethal weapons to Kyiv. We would like to avoid the negative consequences for Russian-South Korean relations, which will inevitably follow suit in case of change in this approach. And, of course, on the double standards of the UN Secretariat. Perhaps it should have been a loud voice in the international community, but no. And, of course, we would like to draw attention to this issue in the context of the Ukrainian situation, and this policy of double standards acquires a blatant character and extends both to the approaches of UN members to the Ukrainian settlement as a whole, as well as to the interpretation of certain principles of the charter of the organization. It is well known that the established within the executive structures of the UN mode of action on the Ukrainian story focuses on the known consensus resolutions of the UN General Assembly adopted on the initiative of Kyiv and its Western sponsors. First of these was Resolution 68/262 of March 27, 2014 on the territorial integrity of Ukraine. It also served as a prologue for 10 Russophobic resolutions adopted within the framework of the 11th Extraordinary Special Session of the UN General Assembly on Ukraine. It is fundamentally important that none of the above-mentioned resolutions has binding legal force. Moreover, all of them were accepted by the General Assembly in excess of its own powers, in violation of the Article 39 of the Charter, which assigns the prerogative of determining the threat to international peace and security to the UN Security Council.
Guided not at all by the letter and spirit of the Charter, but by political directives broadcast by the Western camp, representatives of the political wing of the Secretariat consistently demonstrate their refusal to respect Russia's territorial integrity within its constitutional borders. They dispute the affiliation of Crimea, Sevastopol, the DPR, LPR, Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, which became part of our country through the exercise of the right of peoples to self-determination. Such a line by UN officials is a direct violation of Article 100 of the Charter. According to its Secretariat, staff are obliged, let me repeat, obliged to observe the principle of impartiality. This includes the need to refrain from any actions that might reflect on their position as international officials, responsible only to the organization. To our deep regret, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who in accordance with Article 97 of the Charter is obliged, I repeat, obliged to refrain from biased political statements on behalf of the entire organization and not engage in interpreting Charter norms, time and again makes, to put it mildly, dubious conclusions These clearly highlight who the UN Secretary-General looks up to and whose wrath he fears. Remember well how just recently the Portuguese went so far in his reasoning as to state that the residents of Crimea and Donbass, unlike the people of Greenland, supposedly do not have the right to self-determination. Such conclusions of the Secretary-General, in his own words, are based on a certain study, as he said, of the hierarchy of charter principles prepared by the UN Office of Legal Affairs under the leadership, we already said it, and I repeat, this is a relevant topic, under the leadership of a Swedish citizen, Eleanor Hammarskjöld. We have asked Antonio Guterres many times to show us this epochal document, providing an answer to this matter, but they never presented it. This document supposedly provides an answer to one of the most complex issues in legal science. However, they are in no hurry to share this sacred knowledge. Unlike the students of law schools, UN lawyers are apparently unaware that the principles of international law have no hierarchy and one cannot prevail over another. Their interconnected and interdependent nature is fixed both in the Charter and in the Consensus UNGA Resolution 2625, which approved the Declaration of Principles of International Law of 1970. This document unequivocally states, and I repeat, this is not the first time we're doing this, but it is worth doing since they keep repeating these mistakes, and more than just mistakes. This document unequivocally states that the principle of territorial integrity must be observed concerning states conducting themselves in compliance with the principles of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and thus possessed of a government representing the whole people belonging to a territory without distinction as to race, creed or color. Now let us remember what was said a couple of minutes ago, the statements of Ukrainian official Elena Ivanovska, who supposedly defends the Ukrainian language. Remember what she just said. She said that there are Russian speakers, children, and there are their children, although the Russian-speaking children are citizens of Ukraine, and their children are also Ukrainian citizens, but she makes a distinction, and therefore she deprives the Russian-speaking children of the right to speak their mother tongue. And this is not just her private opinion or her opinion as an official. This is an action plan that she carries out, that she implements. The fact that the Russophobic Kiev Bandera regime, which came to power through a coup, does not represent the residents of Crimea, Donbass and Novorossiya is obvious and requires no more additional proof. The statements of Guterres and the Secretariat he leads not only do not correspond to the goals, principles and tasks of the UN, but also an obstacle to their realization, damaging the authority of the organization as a whole. People keep citing the resolutions on Ukraine at the UN Secretariat. I wonder if, right now, after all these years, when they witnessed the actual killings of the people, the children, the civilians in Gaza, why didn't they quote the same resolutions, dozens of them? Why weren't they so fervent in quoting the resolutions on Palestine? Because these are double standards, the destructive, terrible double standards. And yet another topic on Ukraine, the anniversary of the reunification of Crimea with the Russian Federation. But I would like to remind you about the unique collection of archaeological artifacts stolen from the Crimeans, the Scythian gold. We're talking about a collection of the rarest finds over 2,000 years old, discovered at different times by archaeologists in Crimea. Since then they have been permanently kept in Crimean museums, the Kerch and Bushehr Historical and Cultural Reserves, the Hersenel-Storica National Reserve and the Central Museum of Taurida. The exhibition composed of these exhibits, Crimea, Gold and Secrets of the Black Sea, was held from February 7th to August 31st, 2014 at the Allard Pearson Archaeological Museum of the University of Amsterdam. As is customary in global practice, The Scythian gold exported to the Netherlands for exhibition was supposed to return to Crimea within the agreed time frame, return to the museums that provided the exhibits. However, the Dutch side preferred to be guided not by its obligations to the museums, but by political considerations. As a result, The Hague transferred the collection not to its legal owners, but to the criminal Kiev regime, covering its decision with a biased verdict of the Supreme Court of the Netherlands. And most interestingly, Zelensky and his accomplices keep underlining that Crimea is a part of Ukraine. But why didn't they let a part of Ukraine reclaim its own heritage from the Crimean museums, if they keep insisting that this is a part of Ukraine? Because then they would have to appreciate their priceless heritage, but they have destroyed their heritage. They only needed yet another political process, a loud and clear one, where they would insist on international law and their own national legislation. They just wanted to make more noise. We consider such actions by The Hague as complicity in a crime that dealt a serious blow to the cultural and historical heritage of the Crimean Peninsula. On March 11th this year, 2026, the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation opened a criminal case regarding the theft and non-return of cultural property against officials of the Netherlands, Ukraine, and the Allard Pearson Archaeological Museum. Speaking frankly, we do not know where the Crimean collection is now, whether in Ukraine or somewhere else. We would prefer they shared this information. Unfortunately, considering the special entrepreneurship of Ukrainian dealers, nothing can be ruled out. We've seen them trade in their own sacred objects, and it's not the state that benefits from such sales and traffic. One thing can be said absolutely for sure: everyone involved in this theft will have to answer for the committed crime. I repeat, we proceed from the fact that everything found in Crimean soil must return to the motherland, to Crimea. Another topic. And the cause of the delay for today's briefing. We had many questions and we have prepared a reaction due to the statement and ruling by the Court of Poland regarding the situation around Mr. Butyagin. The District Court of Warsaw confirmed that Mr. Butyagin can be extradited from Poland to Ukraine. This is a political process that has no legal foundation. The ruling is intermediary. There is a week to contest that decision, and we will fight for his expedited return to his motherland. And another one related to the rocket attack against the Bushehr power plant. We condemn the unacceptable missile strike against the internal perimeter of the Bushehr nuclear power plant, mere meters from an active energy block. We have warned Israel and the United States of America continuing their aggressive military operation against the Islamic Republic of Iran that any threats to the health and life of the Russian citizens at the NPP are unacceptable. Tel Aviv and Washington shall refrain from mindless attacks against the nuclear infrastructure, which breeds actual risks of an environmental catastrophe of the regional scale. We expect a condemnation of this incident by the IAEA, which provides guarantees for the Bushehr NPP. We expect a reaction from all the sensible members of the international community, first of all the countries of the Persian Gulf, who would be the first to be hit. We call on the sides involved to come back to reason and take all the measures to de-escalate the tensions. The continued hostilities may result in unforeseen consequences for the entire Middle East, including nuclear consequences, of which we have warned. Moving on to a different region, we welcome the successful referendum on the new constitution in the Republic of Kazakhstan. The results of the citizens' voting, according to the preliminary data from the Central Election Commission, by the end of March 16 this year, turnout was 73%, with 87.15% of the voters saying yes. This testifies to the convincing support for the course of reforms conducted by the Republic's leadership aimed at further strengthening the foundations of statehood and a consistent modernization of all spheres of society's life. According to the assessment of Russian observers accredited from the Federation Council, the State Duma, the Central Election Commission, as well as international regional structures such as the CIS, CSTO and SCO, the Kazakh authorities provided all necessary conditions for holding the plebiscite in full accordance with international norms and generally accepted democratic principles. We are confident that adopting the updated constitution will give an additional impulse to the sustainable development of friendly Kazakhstan. It will foster cohesion of its multinational people and maximum realization of the country's richest potential. We expect that in the new historical stage for the Republic, the relations of alliance and comprehensive strategic partnership between Russia and Kazakhstan will continue to strengthen in the interests of the citizens of both states for the benefit of peace and stability on the Eurasian continent. Moving to the situation in Moldova, official Chisinau does everything to distract the residents of Moldova from serious problems in the economy and social sphere, which are practically on the verge of collapse, and shift the responsibility to our country. On March 15, the President of the Republic, Sandu, commenting on the situation with the environmental degradation of the Dniester River resulting from pollutants entering it from Ukrainian territory, as usual, baselessly laid the blame for this for some reason. Because she always does that, she laid the blame on Russia. She claimed it was caused by a Russian attack on the Dniester hydroelectric power plant in Ukraine. On March 17 this year, Russian ambassador Alexander Butyagin was summoned to the Moldovan MFA. A protest was expressed to him regarding this issue, and as proof, the Moldovan side presented, just bear with me, what did the Moldovan side present as proof to the Russian ambassador? Remember the Western practice of dead ducks, which were presented as proof, or just nothing was presented as proof, mere words that you have the capacity, but this time the Moldovan side, oh wait, I remember there were also 2 vials with white powder. Perhaps this is the example that the Sandu regime used. So, Alek Ozerov, the Russian ambassador to Moldova, was presented proof of the Russian blame. During a meeting at the Moldovan Foreign Ministry, he received some bottle with a cloudy liquid. What did the Moldovan diplomats intend to do with this bottle remains unclear. There were no descriptions, no chemical sample analysis. Nothing was provided. Such a powerful evidence base. Since the US State Secretary Colin Powell did that, why not take a good example? It looks especially absurd that the day before the Russian ambassador was summoned to the Moldovan MFA, the leadership of the Republic's Ministry of Environment stated there was no information about the causes of the incident or the type and amount of the polluting substance. I have a version of my own. Perhaps, given the Moldovan science and education situation, given the lack of real capacity of taking chemical samples and analysis, perhaps they wanted to ask our ambassador to send these samples to Moscow to help the Moldovan counterparts and use our own labs and use our own fundamental scientific institutions to take a look at the contents of this water. I do not judge. I don't make judgments on who took this genius decision. Perhaps Sandu received a call from somewhere, but inside Moldova itself, attention was drawn to inconsistencies in the actions and statements of the country's officials. First of all, suspicion was raised by the fact that the first reports of fuel leaks on the Dniester in northern Moldova appeared back on March 10th this year, but groundless accusations against Russia in this regard appeared several days later. Apparently, the Republic's Ministry of Environment said they had no information about this water. They only needed this for one purpose, to coordinate their position with Brussels and Kiev. Moreover, experts note that the information about the composition of the substance supposedly found by authorities in the main drinking and economic artery of the Republic changed repeatedly. It was reported either as a spill of diesel fuel or engine oil or some other substance. I can't even think about the substances that they meant. Later, they started writing entirely that the real cause of the incident was an overturned Ukrainian truck carrying 30 tons of oil and fuel. The situation is another confirmation that the Moldovan authorities are ready to do anything to keep afloat the myth of some Russian threat to justify their totalitarian actions in redesigning Moldova to so-called European standards, to just deprive it of statehood. You don't have to look far for examples. Official Chisinau is stepping up efforts to deprive Gagauzia of its autonomous status. On March 9th, the Moldovan Minister of Justice appealed to the country's constitutional court with a request to check the constitutionality of several provisions of the law on the special legal status of Gagauzia. According to experts, this may lead to further restriction of the autonomous rights and revision of its self-government mechanisms. Attempts by the Moldovan authorities to change the historical agenda with an emphasis on glorifying Nazi criminals, Hitler's accomplices, are gaining alarming momentum. On March 13th, in the Ochniter district, a memorial cross to Romanian General Stan Poetaș was opened with military honors. Who is this man? He was the one who commanded the suppression of the Hătini uprising in February 1919, which flared up in response to the occupational policy of the Romanian administration and engulfed about 100 settlements in northern Bessarabia. Despite the courage and heroism of the rebels, the uprising was brutally crushed by Romanian punishers. More than 11,000 people were killed and executed. Hundreds were thrown into prisons and sent to hard labor. Dozens of villages were burned. These are now the national heroes the current Moldovan authorities and Sandu have. Pro-government agitators continued to spin the thesis of the pointlessness of cooperation within the CIS for Moldova. The sad consequences for the Moldovan economy from the severing of multi-year ties in the Eurasian space are obvious and, most importantly, confirmed by numbers, by figures. According to the National Statistics Bureau of Moldova, in 2025, the country sold 3 times fewer goods abroad than it bought from abroad. From 2022 to February of this year, food prices rose by 76%. In 2024 to 2025, almost 87,000 jobs were liquidated in agriculture and industry. This stimulates an outflow of the working-age population, which sees no prospects for work in Moldova. In 2025 alone, almost 29,000 people emigrated from the country. According to the media data, 65% of Moldovan university graduates want to leave the country. Official Chisinau can try to blame Russia for all mortal sins as much as it wants, or made-up sins, or those made up by the propaganda, but reality speaks for itself. At the root of Moldova's problems are the incompetent actions of the current authorities, who have been bought, rewired, or who have been set to wear Moldovan clothing, but they are essentially implementing the Euro-Atlantic scenario not for the benefit, but for the destruction of Moldova. And who will have to restore Moldova with what remains of it after Sandu? More than one generation of Moldovans will have to do that.
Speaking of, we talked about neo-Nazism, about history. And every briefing we talk about, what are those people who crush the economics? Those are not aliens. Those are the citizens of Germany who take subsequent decisions on their level. No, they do not ask the opinion of the population of Germany. But who are these bureaucrats? We're well aware of those people in Brussels. But who are those people occupying such high positions in different countries? Let's take a look in the German Foreign Ministry. Let's look at the origins of diplomats and the leaders of the Foreign Ministry. Recently, high-ranking diplomats of Germany have been repeatedly noted with frankly Russophobic statements and militant statements against our country. However, taking into account the very specific traditions of the German Foreign Ministry, this fact is not surprising to us. Let us speak of some figures, and it will not astonish you either. In 2003, in the departmental bulletin of the German Foreign Ministry, the laudatory obituary on the deceased diplomat Franz Nusslein appeared. Seemed normal, but the text of the message omitted the fact that during World War II, Mr. Nusslein served as a prosecutor in occupied Prague, was a member of the National Socialist Germanist Workers' Party, and contributed to the imposition of almost 1,000 death sentences. Such a blatant story caused outrage not only in German society, but also in the ministry itself. Faced with a growing wave of negativity inside the country and from abroad, Joschka Fischer, who headed the agency at the time, forbade the publication of obituaries to former Nazis. However, back then the decision of the minister caused a protest already among the veterans of the diplomatic service. When, in 2004, a year later, another former high-ranking employee of the German Foreign Ministry, Franz Krapf, died. Former SS Untersturmführer and member of the same National Socialist German Workers' Party since 1936, according to the minister's order, his death was not reported in the departmental bulletin. In response, more than 100 retired diplomats published their obituary in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung newspaper, accusing Mr. Fischer of dishonor. Under the influence of this scandal, known as the Vault of Mummies, Fischer was forced in 2005 to establish an independent commission of historians under the leadership of historian Eckhard Pons, which worked for 5 years and released a study of almost 900 pages. The presentation of the report on October 28, 2010, caused a great public outcry in Germany. The book, The German Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Its Past, became a bestseller. Its total circulation was 80,000 copies. And the conclusions of German historians were shocking, most of all to Germans themselves. The report denied the legend that the diplomats of the Third Reich were apolitical professionals who only followed orders. The study showed that they were active and proactive accomplices in the crimes of the Nazis, especially the Holocaust. Historians have found irrefutable evidence that the German Foreign Ministry officers helped organize the deportation and extermination of Jews throughout Europe. The most staggering example is the report of diplomat Franz Rademacher on a business trip to Belgrade in 1941. The purpose of the trip was, direct quote, elimination. Once again, I draw your attention to what was written. Elimination of Jews in Belgrade. End of quote. And that wasn't the whole truth. The post-war history of the German Foreign Ministry also turned out to be no less peculiar. When the German Foreign Ministry was established in 1951, thousands of former Nazi functionaries returned to service. According to the calculations of the Commission, in the first 2 years of the department's existence, 42% of high-ranking diplomats of Germany were previously members of the aforementioned party. This was an even higher percentage than under Hitler or Ribbentrop. That seems like a nightmare fairy tale. It also turned out that the German Foreign Ministry not only hired Nazis, but also actively helped them avoid justice. Diplomats warned wanted criminals about arrest warrants and advised which countries they should avoid traveling to. This is the human rights activists we're talking about. Moreover, the agency helped former Nazis escape to Arab countries or Latin America by issuing them fake passports. Kanzi's report also shed light on the biographies of many famous personalities. For example, Ernst von Weizsäcker, the father of the future president of Germany, Richard von Weizsäcker, who was previously considered a technocrat, who supposedly did not share Nazi ideas. In fact, in 1938, publicly spoke about the, once again, I draw your attention to the fact that this is a direct quote, he spoke about the overabundance of Jews, and he participated in the deprivation of citizenship of writer Thomas Mann. Just think about these facts. Should we be astonished after that by the excessive level of Russophobia planted by political elites of Germany? And another demonstration of it was the behavior of German athletes towards Russian skiers Anastasia Begyan and Sergei Sinekin at the Paralympic Games in Italy. To be fair, it should be stated that such demonstrative hatred caused misunderstanding in Germany itself. So who exactly was raising them? Who was planting these ideas? The foreign policy expert of the German Party Union of Sarah Wagenknecht for Reason and Justice characterized such actions as the bottom of German sports, the most shameful event since 1945. Guido Westerwelle, who held the post of the head of the German Foreign Ministry at the time of publication of the report, speaking at the book presentation ceremony, said that he felt deep shame, promised to make it a desk book for every novice diplomat. Can I ask the German embassy in Moscow, does everyone have that book on their desk? Or the Foreign Ministry of Germany, has anyone actually seen that book? Based on what we're witnessing now, no one has ever had that book on their desk, under their desk, or inside. Perhaps it's gathering dust on the library shelves or in the trash bin. I can only advise my German colleagues to reprint this report and still distribute it to every German official, please. And we will make sure that this report is published, especially online. Oh, and please, if you don't forget to send a copy to Burbach. If you don't do it, then we will do it, if she's so proud of her Nazi grandfather. And now I'm ready to answer your question. Is international life with us? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. Good afternoon. In the opening, you've already touched upon the tragedy in the Middle East and the consequences of this tragedy, especially the energy sector. And this is why I would like to have your commentary about the statement of the European Commissariat on Energy, Jorgensen, who stated that the EU should follow the decision of abstaining from energy resources from Russia despite the high energy prices in Europe. It seems that in order to spite others, I will freeze my ears off. You know, I think it's not just their ears, but I think they've officially frozen anything. I think that the forced refusal of Russian energy sources is at the basis of political programs of the current European Commission. Those are factory settings, and it's obvious that restoring energy dialogue with our country would mean admitting full stability, full unacceptability of any restrictional measures imposed on Russian energy sector before. And there's nothing surprises that the representatives of the European Commission insist that it's impossible to restore regular energy supplies from Russia. Von der Leyen, during the plenary debates in European Parliament on March 11th, stated that return to Russian fuel would be a strategic mistake. I'm sorry, would be a mistake for whom and why? For European citizens, where 1 in 10 can no longer afford central heating to a normal degree, or for European producers who, even before the current crisis imposed by the US and Israel against Iran, had to pay 2-3 times more for electricity and 4 or 5 times more for gas. Has anyone asked their opinion? Has anyone held a public poll? No, this would be a mistake solely for the Brussels establishment. This is not what they're paid for. They're paid for Russophobia. Their career perspectives are interlinkably tied with their course to confronting Russia at any price. This is why such statements of Brussels bureaucrats reflect the heavy presence of Russophobic agenda in the Brussels offices. Meanwhile, our country has never refused mutually beneficial energy cooperation to trustworthy partners, including in Europe. I'd like to recall that on March 9th, during the meeting on the situation on the international oil and gas market, the President of Russia, Putin, once again voiced our approaches to this issue, readiness to joint work with no politicization. In Brussels, they have the exact opposite signals. And it's not about their citizens or business. It's not about entrepreneurs or hard workers. It's about very stupid and very audacious representatives of Brussels bureaucracy who flagrantly have enslaved citizens of the European Union. If that is all, we're moving on. Is RIA News with us? Yes, Madam Zakharova, good afternoon. RIA News, Cristina Rodriguez. If you allow, we have one question today. Can you hear me? I would like to know that earlier the Prime Minister of Belgium, Bart de Wever, called to reach a deal with Russia. How do you assess such statement? How do you assess it? Could we signal a new wave of consciousness amongst Europe? No, I don't think it's no longer funny, but it's astonishing how the same capital is sending very opposing signals, making very contradicting statements. If Madame von der Leyen speaks, if she doesn't speak as a Belgian citizen but European official, calling for prolonged limitations on the Russian oil and energy sources, then the very same Brussels, when their prime minister is speaking, we hear very opposing things, as you've rightfully quoted them. Sooner or later, someone should have made something that would be in opposition of von der Leyen, should have proposed something that was the thesis of self-hypnosis. And the statement of the Belgian Prime Minister is also the sign of deep opposition within the EU. We were constantly fed the myth of European solidarity, that they have similar strives, similar moods. You see what they've done with Hungary, with Slovakia. Now we see how they try not to notice or to ignore statements of Belgium. This is the recognition and admittance of the failure of the current European course against our country, and it also shows that the illusion of imposing strategic defeat on Russia, when touching with reality, that this very same illusion is strategically defeated itself. Of course, this is not yet the total enlightenment. It's just the beginning of internal discussion among those who would like to continue conflict against our country, until the last Ukrainians, for the sake of their own unachievable, self-destructory goals. And those who, like Bart de Wever, suggests first to think about ensuring pragmatic peace, considering the interests of all parties. Any kind of activity following the democratic procedures. According to the Belgian head of government himself, leaders of other states of Europe agree with him. And they said to us as well that they should understand the root causes of the Ukrainian conflict. They agree with him, but in public, they're afraid of disrupting the bloc discipline. That's why they continue to repeat as mantra the need to continue maximum pressure on our country. It's quite telling that the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Belgium, Maxime Prevot, immediately spoke against his leader, decided to argue with him in public, showcasing a wrong signal that could signal the weakness of European unity. That's not a weakness, that's strength. It's almost overcoming. It's a strength that could signal the overcoming of European Union. In any case, it's too preemptive to speak about any kind of change in European approaches and Belgian approaches towards Russia. And it's also clear that those statements are not because they understand the mistake of their actions or the criminality of their actions. Just because they need to leave their comfort zone. Or perhaps the comfort zone has left them at this point. But they've tried to carry it with them, making some unclear statements. I would like to once again point out that such statements that you've mentioned, they signal that this common sense still exists from various sources expressed in different ways, but it's still present. It's just not everyone has enough courage or strength or opportunity to bring forward that thought. And of course, for many Europeans, the situation is no longer that resembling a crisis, but inevitability. But they're the ones who brought themselves there, and they should find a way out. And they should abandon the course of growing confrontation with Russia. And as it seems, another source of pride, their European economic miracle, was based on cheap energy sources in Russia that they have openly refused to their own damage. For the supposed U.S. security that Washington refuses to provide for their own means, despite the fact that Europeans started paying them 2%, then 5%, and the degradation of trade economic figures and the lowering of life standards. One way or another, they will have to wake up from this nightmare. They will have to analyze their actions and choose a new course. Thank you. If you have no further questions, Anna Delou. Madam Zakharova, good afternoon. We have a question concerning Middle East. Foreign Minister Lavrov, during his press conference with his Kenyan colleagues, stated that due to the situation of Iran, Palestinian issue has been left behind and Russia wants to draw the UN Security Council's attention to it. What are the concrete steps and what are the proposals of Russia on resolving the situation in the Middle East? Does it include the Palestinian issue as well?
You know, I would like to quote what you said. As Russian Foreign Minister said during a press conference on March 16. He spoke against the backdrop of armed aggression by the US and Israel against Iran. He said that the Palestinian problem has found itself in deep crisis in which no clearance is seen yet. Palestine is safely being forgotten amid this crisis, amid a large-scale confrontation in the Middle East. This contributes to a multi-year sabotage of fulfilling the well-known UNSC and UNJ resolutions on creating a Palestinian state, and could deal a serious blow to the reputation of the international community, primarily the UN. Russian principled approaches to the Palestinian-Israeli settlement are well known and unchanged. Achieving a durable and long-term peace and security in the region is impossible without a fair resolution of the Palestinian problem, ensuring the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, which implies creating an independent, viable state within the 1967 borders, with its capital in East Jerusalem. This complies with the generally recognized international legal framework with the central two-state solution. Numerous UNSC and UNJ resolutions, including one of the first, number 181 of 1947, with the plan of partition of Palestine into two states, Jewish and Arab. This concept is also embedded in the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002. Let me remind you, and I remember clearly, how these events took place and how they were discussed. According to this document, the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, normalizing relations between Arab countries and Israel is conditioned on a final resolution, in the best sense of the word, of the Palestinian problem. At the same time, it is obvious that in reality the situation is completely different. Contrary to the broad international consensus supporting the two-state formula, confirmed during the two high-level events in July and September 2025 in New York, the US President put forward his comprehensive plan exclusively on ending the conflict in the Gaza Strip, excluding the West Bank, with East Jerusalem, bypassing the UN Security Council and the two-state principle. This plan was then included in UNSC Resolution 2803, which the American authors literally pushed through to give their efforts on Gaza additional international recognition and certain legality. As known, Russia and China abstained from voting on this resolution and did not block its adoption in response to direct addresses from the Arab countries, who now bear the main responsibility for its implementation. It is worth noting that literally 10 days before the US-Israeli aggression against Iran, in Washington on 19th of February, a Peace Council meeting was held. It's also intended by the UNSC Resolution 2803. The creation of Now it's clear to everyone that the Americans and Israelis did not even have in mind to discuss their actions with Arab partners, whom they in fact framed, using the topic of Gaza as well to cover their aggressive anti-Iranian plans. For our part, we consider it important to take urgent measures, not only for ceasing violence and general de-escalation in the Middle East, but also to return the situation to a political and legal track. It is also necessary to return the Palestinian problem, which is the note for the entire region, to the focus of the UN Security Council as the only universally recognized body for maintaining international peace and security. We intend to use these purposes, both already planned events, in particular the briefing and consultations of the UN Security Council on the situation in the West Bank on March 24th, and also to work out the convening of appropriate extraordinary meetings on key tracks of the Middle East settlement, the Palestinian, Lebanese and Syrian. Thank you for this comprehensive response. Thanks to you. Do we have the Izvestia agency? Yes. Hello, Madam Zakharova. Today we have 3 questions for you. The first one: what are the specific actions, steps by other countries that the Russian Foreign Ministry considers a factor driving tension in the Arctic, and what risk reductions initiatives is Russia promoting? The Arctic, yes. In recent years, as stated on numerous occasions, the Arctic, through the efforts of Western countries, has turned into a zone of geopolitical confrontation. The principle of high latitudes, low tension no longer works, unfortunately. NATO, as the power instrument of the collective West, has embarked on active exploration of the northern flank, building up its military potential there. in the Arctic under the alliance's auspices, and according to national plans of member states, about a dozen major exercises are held regularly with the participation of seemingly distant from the polar region countries, Belgium, Germany and France. Right now, the northern regions of Norway, Finland and Sweden, as well as the waters of the Norwegian and Barents Seas, are hosting the Cold Response 2026 maneuvers, held from March 5th to the March 20th, 2026. During these drills, about 40,000 servicemen of NATO are honing skills to counter as stated, an equal strength adversary, read Russia. Meanwhile, the opinion of the local population, as usual, interests no one. It goes to an absurd scale. Recently, journalists from the Norwegian state broadcasting company reported that during the maneuvers, British troops, to the horror of the Sami people, the local indigenous population, harassed local reindeer, driving around the herd for 3 days for beautiful photos. I hope just the photos, which was the reason for the harassment of the British servicemen of the local reindeer. The growing duration of these exercises of the military, of the member states, of the individual and group voyages of warships and submarines regularly performed beyond the Arctic Circle is indicative, one of their stated goals being to promote freedom of navigation in the north, including near the waters of the Northern Sea route, under the pretext of threats supposedly originating from Russia and now China as well. You're well aware that Russia and China are the major stakeholders in such activities, but in reality, neither Russia nor China have never engaged in such activities. It is NATO countries who do that. They engage in maritime piracy. So, under the pretext of threats from Russia and China, in February 2026, the launch of Operation Arctic Sentinel was announced. We have made numerous comments about it. Essentially, it is aimed at establishing their own rules in the polar region and containing geopolitical competitors. In turn, the European Union adopts ever new packages of illegitimate sanctions that create additional obstacles for the development of the Russian Arctic and international cooperation in the north. An updated EU Arctic policy is expected to be published this year, and we have no doubts we'll make a comment on that. But even now we understand that it will carry a confrontational character. Additionally, so-called partners still, I put this word in quote, still refrain from unfreezing the full format work of the Arctic Council, artificially limiting physical contacts among representatives of northern indigenous peoples from different countries, which naturally cannot help reduce tension in the region. I believe that all these steps undoubtedly aggravate the situation. Ice should melt from friendly embraces, or mutual help and assistance, or expression of sympathy for each other, rather than the escalation of tensions in the Arctic. They only create threats. I am speaking of the Western policy in the far north. They only create threats to Russia's security and increase the risks of unintentional incidents, which under a negative scenario could lead to the start of armed confrontation. It is important to emphasize that Russia, as the largest Arctic power, is not interested in such a development. We are open to mutually respectful dialogue with foreigners, including extra-regional ones. We support the implementation of economic projects conforming to high environmental standards, further unlocking the potential of the Northern Sea route, development of scientific research activity, preservation and multiplication of the rich heritage of indigenous peoples. We will continue to exert all necessary efforts to protect Russia's interests in the Arctic and maintain peace and stability in the region. Thank you. The second question Abbas Araghchi stated that the Islamic Republic of Iran does not intend to ask the US for a temporary ceasefire or truce. It plans to fight to the end. How does the Russian Foreign Ministry assess this decision by Iran? Do you believe that this position could heighten tensions in the region, and what consequences for international relations might arise as a result of such position by Iran? I would like to underline the most important thing. We cannot forget. It is unacceptable to forget that Tehran did not unleash the spiral of violence in the region. The cause was an unprovoked attack under the guise of US-Iranian talks. At the height of the talks on the Iranian nuclear program, they launched this cowardly attack. The position of our Iranian friends, who are fully determined to bravely confront the brutal attack on their homeland, is more than understandable to us. And at the same time, we still consider de-escalation and the quickest possible cessation of destructive military actions, which the peaceful population suffers from the most, both in Iran and in Gulf countries, to be an imperative, returning to the search for political ways to resolve the conflict, maintaining dialogue with involved parties. We continue to urge them to do this. And the third question, according to the Hungarian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Peter Szijjártó, Hungary will state at the meetings of EU foreign and energy ministers that it will not support the 20th package of sanctions against Russia and the €90 billion loan to Ukraine until Kiev launches the Druzhba pipeline. How does Russia assess Hungary's decision to block the 20th package of sanctions against Russia and the €90 billion loan to Ukraine until oil supplies through the Druzhba pipeline resume? I believe that you have seen media reports and wrote them yourselves, stating that the European Union, I don't know how to put it, has already found a way or come up with a way of bypassing the veto of Hungary and provide a loan to Kiev. You see what is happening. The West is destroying international law, destroying what used to be called Euro-solidarity. They do not appreciate their own member states. They do not appreciate the positions of sovereign states violating the rights of their own members and the rights of these countries in their national capacity, since EU membership shall not deprive the member states of their independence. They shall not request the resignation of their national sovereignty. These states, under the yoke of Brussels, shall not adopt the anti-popular measures. We have reiterated on numerous occasions that we highly appreciate the balanced foreign policy of the Hungarian leadership, which, contrary to colossal pressure exerted by Brussels, pursues a pragmatic foreign policy course and firmly defends its national interests, including a sovereign position in dialogue with Russia. Kiev's suspension of transit through the Druzhba pipeline to Hungary threatens its energy security. These are words stated in Budapest. This action caused justified outrage among Hungarian authorities, who assessed such actions as a direct encroachment on the country's sovereignty. Not just sovereignty in theory. This is about sovereignty in practice, since this is linked to the well-being of citizens. And this does not detriment from the well-being of other EU member states, but for some reason Budapest is suggested to renounce the interests of its own people. We will keep making comments on this topic, unfortunately, since we see how it all started. Certain sources supposedly said that the European Union would blatantly disregard Hungary's veto right. We have sources for that, but in general, all the steps taken by the European Union confirm that. They have confirmed that in practice, since they have expressed a similar attitude to other EU member states. But Budapest and the Hungarians have a certain courage, so to speak, to stand up for themselves, to raise their voice and defend their rights, while the other EU members have no such courage. I am not even talking about Slovakia, where Mr. Fitz defends his national sovereignty, endangering his own life. And now you see the direct threats against Viktor Orban as well, threats to his life and the lives of his family. If you do not have any more questions, we will move forward. Do we have the Sputnik Uzbekistan agency? Yes, good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. Greetings from Tashkent, International Information Agency Sputnik Uzbekistan, Alisher Kinbaev. Hello. Last week, French President Emmanuel Macron acknowledged Europe's dependence on Russian uranium and announced his intention to replace it with supplies from other countries such as Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. How does the Russian Foreign Ministry assess the prospects for interaction in this sphere with Central Asian countries, as well as possible increasing geopolitical competition around the region's resources? Thank you. I am not sure how to begin the answer to your question, keeping in mind that Washington made a hint to Macron that he should leave soon. I am not sure how exactly he is supposed to leave. But it is true that this dichotomy of the rhetoric of NATO, that prides itself in its unity, is starting to be a concern for the world community. It is true. We learn of it every day from the news. Frankly speaking, as I said, upon getting verification that this is not a fake, we are forced to check all the most absurd news, and unfortunately we find out that these are indeed not fake. With the development of technologies involving active use of critical raw materials, the demand for them is also growing. We regularly report on that. We see how, against this background, the collective West is trying to stake out access to the Central Asian market for these specific natural resources, often acting regularly through non-market methods and simultaneously striving to drive a wedge into our cooperation with the states of the region. We insist on the principles of mutual respect, equality, and consideration of interests of each other. But the West acts from a different position, the position of colonial domination. I emphasize this diametrically differs from our principles of doing business with Central Asian friends. Our cooperation is based on mutual respect, equality, and consideration of interests. That is exactly how we build interaction with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan regarding creating a modern nuclear energy industry in these countries and implementing NPP construction projects.
Thank you. Thank you. Is Russia Today India with us? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. I hope you can hear me. The Indian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has commented on the talks between New Delhi and Tehran on the passing of Indian ship from the Hormuz Gulf as a result of, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has also stated that if the negotiation process started by India joins other actors and inspires them to join that process, the world will be all the better for it. According to Moscow, could India serve as the mediator in the negotiations on the lowering tension in the Middle East? I believe that in the current situation, any efforts of the responsible members of the international community to find ways out of the terrible crisis caused by the unprovoked aggression of the US and Israel on Iran would be fruitful. And of course, such a powerful nation as India could play its part in this process. Thank you. Thank you. Is Sinhua with us? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. Sinhua Agency. Japan recently received the American winged rocket Tomahawk, which was the first case of Japan's purchase of offensive rockets of foreign production. How does Russia assess current efforts of Japan to remilitarize? You know, we've earlier commented on the line of official Tokyo that takes steps to remilitarize its country, including the purchase of striking systems such as winged rockets that could not be qualified as defense type of arms. We'd like to state that if the leadership of Japan does not want to find itself in the same position it was 80 years ago after the Second World War, they should learn the lessons of history and first of all follow the positions of the national constitution. We have drawn attention to the Japanese side to the destructive actions of the forced blowout of the military budget, and it also applies to the purchases of arms that could potentially affect national security of bordering states, including Russia. This course negatively affects not just the regional, but also the global stability, and could lead to the unwanted growth of tension in the Asia-Pacific region, entering the new stage of the arms course. The appearance of new rocket threats for the Russian territory will, of course, invoke our reaction, including the compensating measures in order to preserve the necessary level of defense capabilities. Thank you so much. Thank you. Is Reuters with us? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. Good afternoon. We're here. And we have a question about Iran. Recently, the West is making more and more reports that Russia is aiding Iran by supplying UAVs as well as with intelligence information, including the satellite images of the military objects of the US in the Middle East. How could you comment such statements? I could only comment in the following way. Your question perhaps not proves, but it calls for another question. Have you heard of Washington's statements that they've already won? So what exactly are the US journalists drawing attention to? It seems there should be no ground for such fears if those who started the military aggression on Iran now declare their so-called victory. So there's nothing to discuss on this track. So I believe they should agree on their position. And the floor should be given in order to explain in detail by those who started all of this, and perhaps ask another question. A lot has been asked already, but we've already seen what kind of answers we've received. So it should not start with Russia, that is constantly blamed for something. As soon as something goes not according to plan, they immediately remember these Russophobic factor. No, we should follow a different line of action. We should fully concentrate on the root causes by those who started these aggression. And then once we get the truth from them and a full-scale discussion on this topic, we should start a search of those supposedly responsible. Please, because so many times We've been responsible for the surge of prices on oil and gas in Europe, even though we've suggested long-term contracts. Just remember what the Russian president said at the specified international forums, at numerous press conferences, when answering questions, during interviews, highlighting the fact that long-term contracts could serve as a guarantee of the non-influence of international structures to those countries who rely on energy sources from abroad. And first, they prohibited themselves from purchasing energy sources from us, and then they're blaming Russia. I'm sorry, but before touching upon this subject, there's no even reason to try to excuse it. First of all, we should give the floor to those who've started it. We hear the very same things they've been saying, that they have now apparently claimed victory. Thank you so much, Madam Zakharova. Thank you. Keep asking. I will miss you the whole upcoming week. Is the Media Corporation of China with us? Yes, Madam Zakharova, good afternoon. We have two questions. First of all is following the last topic. The U.S. administration of Donald Trump planned this week to create a coalition to free the ships going through the Hormuz Gulf, and they also plan to exert pressure on European, Asian, and other countries in order to send military ships, but these countries have not responded to it just yet. How does Russia, based on international law, consider these military alliance initiated and headed by one country that does not have the license from the UN Security Council? You know, as for the international law and its norms, we're speaking of the Hormuz Channel, yes. If we speak through the lens of international law, the countries who have responded to the call that you've mentioned, they're practically, as the experts have been saying, based on specialized norms of law. They will be the parts of conflict, and they will be the conspirators of the U.S. in their operation against the sovereign state of Iran. So that's why their worries and their discussions are based on, I do not want to discuss their line of thinking because it's different to understand where they're operating from. But many of those discussing this subject return to the legal basis, and that's where they're drawing conclusions from. The Russian position on this issue remains unwavering. We believe that the resolution of issue of the ship and transition through the Hormuz Channel should be found at the negotiations table through the diplomatic channels. And I will not refer to it as a situation. This is an attack on a sovereign state. And the subsequent chain of actions, of events, of steps, acts of aggression, it should always start with the root causes. And we call this aggression unprovoked and absolutely baseless, which is why we once again repeat our call, all sides, to cease any military actions and to transfer the situation through political diplomatic channels. As long as they have enough political will and human will, they have all the opportunities for that. Thank you. Second question. Following the escalation of the Middle East, the army of Israel stated that they've started the ground operation against Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon, and the Minister of Defense stated that this operation is stated against the residents of the north of the country. How does Russia assess this situation and how it could further escalate the situation in the Middle East. All your questions are aimed in the exact same spot. You see, the chain reaction of this escalation has taken over the region of the Middle East after, allow me to repeat myself, but since we're on the same subject, after the unprovoked aggression of the US and Israel against Iran, but it also touched upon the Lebanese Republic. It has affected many countries, but so of course it affected Lebanon as well. And especially alarming is that the mass rocket bomb strikes of Israel against Hezbollah objects lead to numerous human victims, as well as the destruction in the civilian infrastructure. All the footage and images, all the testimonies of eyewitnesses only confirm it. According to Lebanese authorities, number of victims of these systematic strikes that are often conducted in heavily populated areas in Beirut, among others, has already overpassed 900 people, almost 1,000, and over 2,200 people have been injured. And by now, around 1 million Lebanese have been forced to flee their homes. Of course, we resolutely speak against these actions. Attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are unacceptable, no matter who they're conducted against, no matter who conducts them. And we're convinced that the conducting of, even as they say, limited ground operation in South Lebanon will inevitably lead to the further escalation of the armed conflict and the aggravation of the already difficult humanitarian situation in the country. We call for the speedy seizure of military actions and the full implementation of the Resolution 1701 of the UN Security Council that stipulates the obligations of all sides. And we've also drawn attention to the President of Lebanon on Beirut's readiness for direct negotiations with Israel with international mediation in order to find the initiative of resolving this crisis. And we believe that this proposal should be reviewed by the Israeli side. We once again reaffirm our support for sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the Lebanon Republic. And we advocate for the efforts in the interest of the stable and long-term normalization of the situation around Lebanon and the Middle East. Thank you. Is Bolt News with us? Yes, good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. The Bolt countries call for further sanctions against Russia despite the oil process. What is your opinion on the Baltic countries? Is their opinion heard in Europe? And how do our measures actually affect the countries in the region? You see, the authorities or the regimes of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, despite common sense, despite obvious benefits of peaceful cooperation, have immediately renounced such track of developing connections with our countries. And I don't know if they've made this choice alone or under some kind of pressure, and they've simply chosen the course for confrontation. And the fruits of the self-destructive policy are witnessed today. And their transport and logistics structure are also seen in Estonia, who when visiting Australia do know what he referred to as Europe as an old fat cat. So either they do not consider themselves to be part of Europe, or that's how they treat themselves. In Estonia, the rate of people who don't work. In Estonia, this level is one of the highest in the EU against the backdrop of European countries renouncing Russian energy carriers. We're fixating the unprecedented growth of prices for oil for energy. I would also like to recall the shocking statistics in demographics. Latvia is among the world leaders, or I should say anti-leaders, if we follow statistically correct language on depopulation. The population sinks by 1.15% yearly. And overall, that figure has overpassed 30%. So all of this is obvious. People are fleeing from this Baltic ghetto. Of course, very democratic and very supportive of freedom. Not in search of human rights, but just in search of food, in search of realizing their artistic potential, their talents, their life purpose. Unable to find such opportunities back home. And this trend will continue getting stronger, because these are the conditions created by the regime, when the representatives of elite think not about the well-being of their people, but how to better and easier serve those who keeps throwing a bone to that ghetto. Thank you. Thank you. Is News.ru with us? Good afternoon, Zakharova. We have 2 questions today. Yes, I'm all ears. First, how do you assess another anti-Russian statement of the head of the European diplomacy, Kaja Kallas, that Russia's actions in Ukraine have led to the erosion of the international law, which in turn has decided the escalation of tension in the Middle East and in Ukraine? Well, of course, Kallas once again said something silly and lied, because I would like to recall I've spoken today about NATO's aggression against Libya. Has Kaja Kallas heard of something like that? Ask her, how was that related to Russia? By a simple fact that Russia said, should such aggression take place, it will lead to numerous issues for the European continent itself. Whereas the strike was launched against North Africa, but the rise in the migrant flow or many other issues from the illegal arms trade or the drug trade, and of course that's what happened. And then a year after year, they hold the Mediterranean conference, the political one. Oh, how is it that that happened? And every time when Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, attended that conference, he drew attention to the fact how they applauded the fact and definitely didn't say anything how those Libyan plans were made. And now they seek answers in everything other than their own misgivings and mistakes. So it's yet another example not of double standards, but of stupidity and lies, and efforts of wash away any responsibility for the criminal mistakes they have committed in international affairs. Right now and throughout history as a whole, the shaking of international system is at the behest of Westerners themselves, the bombarding of Yugoslavia in 1999. And what Estonia said for that matter. 1999, Estonia was democratically independent for 10 years back then. What was Estonia's approach to bombings of Belgrade, to the killings of citizens? What was Estonia saying back in the day? Or other crimes committed by them. Iraq. Does Kaja Kallas recall how many countries, how many people contributed to the Iraq coalition? Perhaps she should speak about it. Perhaps she should speak about international reasons for this attack on the sovereign state. And I'm pretty sure she will not be able to recall and can tell you there were no reasons for that, but Estonia participated in that operation. So she should recall what kind of decisions were made and how they stated. Syria, Libya, and Yemen, and Afghanistan, we did not recall today, but yet another clear example. What kind of international law they recalled. And even in political circles, they did not speak about international law on the rules-based world order.
Why are they now talking about dismantling the international system? They have been doing that for a long time. They keep shaking it. To justify their actions, they came up with the formula of a rules-based world order. Within the framework of this wording, they were the ones defining the rules, defining what violates them and what does not. They made no reference to international law, which they perhaps should remember. She could ask Mr. Borrell how exactly the formula of the beautiful garden and the wide jungle was compliant with international law. According to the European head of diplomacy, this was the policy they were pursuing. Now, speaking of Ukraine, it was the West, and primarily the European Union, who were at the origins of the current crisis. They were the ones who supported the anti-constitutional coup d'etat in 2014. And then they expressed all the signs of interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine since 2013, when they orchestrated so-called protests in Maidan. They were carrying out the Western scenario and pushing for the scenario of the Euro-integration of Ukraine. When Yanukovych said that he needed time to evaluate the risks and the damages of such steps, when he said that he needed time to think, they started preparing to change the regime in Ukraine. They blatantly interfered in the sovereign affairs of other states, disregarding international law everywhere. Now we see the same in Moldova. They are not preparing it for Euro-integration. They are preparing it for destruction as a sovereign state, wherever you look. Look what they've done to Georgia. Georgia, based on its law, based on its international law, and as a sovereign state, and exercising its right as a sovereign member of the international community, they decided to develop a law, the same law that the Western countries have to defend themselves from foreign interference. Look at what they did. Look at the interference into Georgian affairs that followed. Look how they trained the politicians who were ethnically of the same people, but rewired with the Western narratives to be sent into the countries. Look how they duped the international community with the non-compliance with the Minsk agreements, and later they said that they had no intention of complying. This is what we should proceed from. These are the absolute facts. Now, since our time is limited, I will just enumerate these factors. But overall, for Kaja Kallas herself, she probably shouldn't forget that as the head of the so-called European diplomacy, she bears responsibility for all actions or inaction of the European Union on the foreign policy track, both those she personally had a hand in and those relating to the period before her arrival at her current post, the Borrell period, and earlier, since the consequences are still felt to this day, and they are becoming ever stronger with their anti-legal positions, then it would be easier for her to understand the whole cause and effect relationship between the flawed policy pursued by the European Union in recent decades and the European Commission and the current crisis situation in international affairs. But they specifically recruit the likes of Kaya Kallas, the ones who never consider their responsibility, those who have no shame or consciousness or conscientiousness, those who simply keep repeating the same record. The second question. If the US-Israeli war against Iran in the Persian Gulf continues, there will be 45 million of starving people in the world, according to the World Food Programme analysis. Russia traditionally provides assistance to countries in need. Is the Russian Foreign Ministry preparing such programs if the food situation deteriorates? This is not directly a question for the Foreign Ministry. This is a question for the organizations in our country responsible for evaluating the damages and the threats to security in the national and the international context. It is true that there is a foreign political angle to this problem, and the Russian Foreign Ministry participates in the international efforts to provide humanitarian assistance to the countries in need, and in this regard we act in an impartial manner. We do not use any political quasi-directives. We evaluate the actual needs of the people using bilateral channels. I mentioned the help we provided to Iran at its request, using the capacity of international organizations, including the UN systems. I regularly share materials about that, speaking of our contributions and our plans that we develop and contribute to. The multilateral platforms that we use are, first of all, the World Food Programme of the UN. We establish our cooperation on the package non-sponsorship and financing. We allocate at least $40 million yearly to purchase Russian food products. Apart from that, we support project activities of the World Food Programme for the sustainable development of school food programs in Central Asia, Trans-Caucasus region, Africa and Latin America. I regularly talk about it, and we see the efficiency of such cooperation formats. This is specific aid to specific people in need that provides specific results. We truly remain a reliable and effective partner for the World Food Programme, and the Russian Emergency Situation Ministry provides serious help too. I will make no mistake if I said that we have the true ambassadors of peace, those who bring the much-needed humanitarian assistance to distant regions of the world. And we bear the olive branch of peace that bears good fruit. We see the warmth and the hope expressed by our Emergency Situation Ministry, and we see how they are received abroad. And our civil society plays an important role too. Our NGOs, non-commercial organizations, provide much help. Look at the situation in Gaza. We provided a lot of humanitarian assistance, as well as for Syria and Donbass, until the moment that referendums were held and they reunified with Russia. Remember how much humanitarian aid was sent there since 2014. These are just a few examples. We do this work for different regions, including Africa and Asia. In the recent years, many regions have suffered from the destructive consequences of technological disasters, as well as earthquakes and other natural disasters, and we often show initiative in offering such help, and when we receive such requests, the Russian leadership pays special attention to them. I believe that our readiness to help at any moment has been proven by our specific actions, and we do this on a highly professional basis, with no compensation. Thank you very much. Do we have the Italian News Georgia agency? Yes, we are here. Good afternoon. Madam Zakharova, good afternoon. This is the TAR News Information Agency, Georgia. Russia has repeatedly declared its readiness to begin a direct dialogue with Georgia on existing problematic issues. At the same time, according to polls, a significant part of Georgia's population supports restoring friendly and partnership relations with Russia and supports the idea of such negotiations, including myself, a journalist from Georgia dealing with this topic for over 15 years. However, Georgian authorities have not yet met these proposals. How could you assess the current situation, and how long is the Russian side willing to wait until Tbilisi matures for a dialogue? Thank you. If I may, first of all, I would like to express my condolences to you and through your media, condolences to those citizens of Georgia and all the people representing the Georgian people in different parts of the world, all those who grieve the death of the Catholicos of all Georgia. I am aware of the warmth and the special spiritual fervor expressed by the people of Georgia, how you treat your religion and your history. This is a part of your history, an important and a great part of your culture. And words of sympathies and condolences will be expressed by the Russian officials. The Patriarch Cyril of Russia has already expressed his condolences, very deep words, and in my personal capacity I would like to express our condolences as well. And now, if I may, I would like to answer your question. I would like to say that you are absolutely right. More and more citizens and politicians of Georgia are speaking in favor of restoring relations with Russia. The Russian-Georgian, Georgian-Russian relations were greatly hit by those who manipulated the situation in the Caucasus, in South Caucasus in general, and in the Northern Caucasus in the Russian territory, those who manipulated the situation in the post-Soviet space, those who tried to sow chaos in our once common space. They did this without regard to the historical links, and in spite of the historical links and ties bringing us together, they did this in a blatant and cynical manner. They provoked conflicts, they provoked clashes, and they partially succeeded in these provocations, but they wanted to do much more, but failed to succeed. It is true that relations have been severed. I will not remind you of the history, but this was not Russia's initiative to sever these ties. In the recent years, we see that the economic and humanitarian links are slowly restoring, and there are specific manifestations and results of that. We see that the current authorities of Georgia say that they shall be guided by the will of the Georgian people. I would like to see the practical steps in this direction. I would like to emphasize that the ball is not in our court, but we are ready for an interesting athletic game, with good sportsmanship, of course. And if I may, I will continue this topic at the next briefing with specific figures and data on the possibilities and the opportunities we have on this track. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and please accept our deep condolences. Thank you. Do we have the Al-Mayadeen? Al-Mayadeen, are you with us? If not, we will move back to you. Yes. Yes, we are here. And Zhukov Al-Meidin, our question. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot spoke about the growing international isolation of Russia after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, the kidnapping of Maduro by the Americans, and the assassination of the supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei. He called for increasing pressure on Russia. How could you comment on this position? I think that he should be worried about his own future, mindful of the fact that Washington recently doubted the political future of Emmanuel Macron. I'm not sure what they said about his foreign minister, but I think that this is what he should be worried about, and this is what he should focus on, rather than more ridiculous statements by Paris. Unfortunately, recently there's quite a lot of them. Here's what I would like to say. I'm not sure if this was a slip of the tongue or a deliberate phrasing, saying that the situation with Nicolas Maduro and the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei were reasons to build up pressure against Russia. If he sees the assassination of the Ayatollah as positive news for the anti-Russian coalition, then this is an admission of guilt of sorts. This is an admission of guilt in such anti-legal activities, which goes against all norms of international law, morality. If this is not a slip of the tongue or a quote taken out of the context, this is yet more proof that clearly shows the true attitude of Paris and Macron's administration, not only toward our country, but also toward the world, including Iran, and international law and the international community in general, including the United Nations. We see, no matter how hard Paris tries to keep its distance from the American-Israeli aggression, no matter how hard they try to distance and keep a balance, such statements by the French foreign minister are self-revealing. And a second interesting point, with such statements of their foreign minister, in parallel, at the same time, a few days later, they also say that they want to establish contacts with us. Excuse me, but I think they find themselves in quite a confusion. If they're confused, please don't confuse the others. And using this occasion of your question, I would like to point this out. Please state your position. If your position is already defined, and if this is the official position of France, then how can we talk about any contacts with our country with such narratives? If you do not have any other questions, no, I do not. Thank you very much. Do we have the Lente.ru? Yes, good afternoon. We have one question for you. Recently, South African media reported that the US is allegedly trying to pull South Africa out of BRICS. Besides, the format has started being criticized for lacking consolidated support for Iran, a member of this association. How will you comment on these reports, and how is the conflict in the Middle East changing BRICS? Could you repeat the last part of the phrase? How could you comment on how is the conflict in the Middle East changing BRICS? Let us begin with the first part of your question. We have seen such leaks. They were quoting unnamed sources. Later, representatives of South Africa asked how they could comment on that. And on March 11th this year, South African Minister of International Relations and Cooperation said at a press conference that no demands, formal or informal, for South Africa to exit BRICS were made by American ambassador to Pretoria. However, it is a fact that Washington is not favorable of BRICS. They see it as a threat or as a challenge. Washington is not trying to hide that.
As for the escalation in the region of the Persian Gulf, which was once again, I would like to recall, caused by the baseless, unprovoked aggression of the US and Israel on Iran, of course affects the regional and international stability and international relations as a whole. In the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russian Federation and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of our country, Sergei Lavrov, has repeatedly spoken on this topic. And I would like to call your attention to the fact that other BRICS countries have also made their own statements. And within this organization, we also discuss this topic actively. All the interested, and here I mean the BRICS format, that everyone is interested in lowering the tension of this crisis. Of course, there are different phrasings, and each country has a right to it. This is very normal for diplomacy, but the most important fact is that all the BRICS member states strive for achieving tangible results, and we're ready to support our friends in India who are presiding in this organization this year. Thank you. Do you understand how the information focus is shifting? You're asking that a lot are criticizing BRICS for, what did you say? For the lack or for unsubstantial phrasing. You see, two states on a daily basis launch strikes on the civilians of the sovereign state who responds protecting their own territory. Moreover, this escalation is gaining ground. Meanwhile, BRICS is the one receiving criticism. That's quite strange. I believe we have a common cause for criticism, and not because we should be friends based on who we should unite against, but because we have objective realities. And because we also have an understanding amongst the BRICS states on how we could avoid that. Each state uses its own language, its own phrases, based on its own analytics, but each BRICS state has expressed itself in one way or another. There's no contradiction or division because of it. So let's not even seek, but let's see real causes for criticism that truly require critical assessment, because the strikes are launched by ones while BRICS is still receiving criticism. If that is all, we're moving on. Is author E with us? Yes, good afternoon, Madam Zakharova, Ruslan Pankratov, author E. We have only one question for you from the favorite area that please call the doctors. I believe it's highly popular. During the address to the European Parliament on March 11 this year, the Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, has affirmed the course of integration with the European Union and stated that, now direct quote, if the EU accepts Armenia as a full-fledged member, that will be excellent. If not, we will still come out victorious, because we will be the country that fully responds to the EU standards, end of quote. And then he goes on to say that a number of church members of the Republic who used to be the agents of KGB in the USSR try to sacrifice the independence of Armenia to the interests of third-party country. I believe you understand what countries they're referring to. How could you comment that? No, I do not understand what countries that's referring to and who Mr. Pashinyan is aiming at when he states the KGB officials. Mr. Aliyev, yes, that's who he is referring to, as far as I understand it from the subtext. Is he saying that about Gaidar Aliyev? No, from the church officials of the Republic. How some of them used to be the KGB agents of the USSR, now supposedly try to instill some reason. As he says, try to sacrifice the independence of Armenia to serve the interests of third countries. I believe he's referring to Russia. I don't think it's that clear. If he says that if we're admitted to the EU, it's good, but if not, we're still the winners, I believe these people win chess games against themselves. That's the same kind of rhetoric and logic. I've seen how his address was analyzed in detail by many experts on the online space. Those who are interested on this track can get familiar with many assessments. I will not go into detail. As for the discussions that have to do with us, in this European vector of the Armenian development, what requires our attention is that abstract standards of the EU are presented as an absolute, explicit good. And even if it doesn't happen, they're still victorious. It's quite a beautiful image. Although unclear what's the basis for it, considering the deep crisis the EU has brought themselves to. Those are not just words, those are real figures of the reduction of industrial production, the growing figures of state debt, the migration crisis, the energy carriers prices that are introduced in production and then reflected. And considering the European standards, it's especially interesting that against their producing, Yerevan was not even involved. Nobody asked them. As for the international unions in the European Unions, CIS and EU, Armenia is a full-fledged member of not just the unions, but of creating norms, standards, criteria, and decisions are all taken with the participation and the discussion of projects by all members. EU is showing stable trajectory of growth of economics of its member states, expanding its share in the global GDP. The economics of Armenia has preserved its growth rates over the world level of 7.2%, thanks in large to the trade economic ties with EU, and we have repeatedly stated on different levels and in different formats that participating in European and Eurasian international projects at the same time is impossible. It does not align with logic or common sense or with economy rules. Planning to impose EU standards while also trying to avoid norms and provisions of the EU is just unrealistic. And it's not a political statement. It's not because we're for or against something. It's just a fact. We hope that the Armenian leadership that has repeatedly promised us not to suspend their cooperation within EU and not to create more obstacles for Russian business will continue to carry out their obligations or to criticize their position. As for the relations of the Armenian government and the church, we have already spoken about it. I believe that the mentioning of the so-called KGB agents was done first and foremost to gain popularity among the Westerners who, I believe, still live in this anti-Soviet paradigm and are in a state of anti-Soviet mania. We have repeatedly pointed out the destructive course and nature of the marginalized religion, beliefs, church, and the issue of the church members, religious traditions. These insinuations could lead to a very dangerous division in the society. And they destroy not the reputation or the image of the political career of some figures. They destroy traditions of the society where this or that religion is more present. They destroy traditions. They plant the seed of disbelief. It means that it's not about people not being allowed to know the truth, but it's about politicizing all these issues. They can be solved, and there are means of overcoming. They're a world example of how sensitive issues are solved delicately. But here, talking about a real fight, that has touched many people. And instead of truly focusing on ever-present, relevant issues of Armenian society that is overcoming problematic issues and is facing similar issues to the rest of the world, instead of overcoming these daily, routinely issues, these issues of religion, or becoming a trading coin or something to distract attention from real issues, so that the attention will be diverted to the constant clashes. There are debates that are destructive, and these destructive debates, contrary to those that could lead to actual positive results, I'd like to recall once again, Russia is interested in strong and truly sovereign Armenia. Thank you so much. Thank you. We will hope for the best. Moving on. Is the embassy live with us? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. Good afternoon. We only have one question. How likely is the disruption of the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine if Zelensky continues to openly threaten European leaders? Should Russia apply more strict methods and come from the position of force in order and just stop any negotiations with the terrorist regime of Zelensky? This question was touched upon by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, by the minister after his meeting with his colleague from Kenya. I'd like to once again state that the President of Russia, Putin, has repeatedly stated that we're devoted to the negotiations process, and we have continuously been devoted to it. We'd continue to stay devoted to it, to diplomacy as a real tool of solving and resolving crises. But as the Kiev regime is not prepared for it, our country will achieve the goals of the special military operation through military means, which is exactly what is being done right now, which is what the Russian leadership has repeatedly stated. For 7 years, we have waited for the West to do their part when it comes to implementing the Minsk agreement. And then what happened? Considering the provocative nature of Kiev regime, which led to more victims at the end of 2021, early 2022. Now there were attempts of negotiations process in 2022 and 2025. Every time we've said when sitting down at the negotiations table. No matter, we understood who we were sitting down with, how they were behaving, but we were dealing with humanitarian aspects. And you're speaking of whether it should or should not be done. Why is it being done? I'm sorry, but because of these contacts, these negotiations, these meetings, our citizens came back home. Our guys who were kept by the Kiev regime, who were waiting for Russia to bring them back, and Russia brought them back to their mothers, their wives, their children. Was it not worth it? What are you talking about? And not just these issues, but other issues of humanitarian nature were solved. That's just... Let's keep that in mind. Let us not forget that. Just look at the footage, the images, faces of those who came back, those who waited, who hoped, and they did not hope in vain, because Russia does not leave anyone behind. Thank you. Thank you. Is the voice of fatherland with us? Yes, good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. We only have two questions. Recently created in the Islamic Parliament, the Commission on investigating of Russia's influence last week adopted a plan of action. First of all, the members of Commission want to work out the method of investigating the activity on influence against Estonia. They want to understand, while receiving more money, how much taxpayer Estonian money was used to support Russia propaganda, as well as the activity to create division in society. Madam Zakharova, what do you think? What could this witch hunt lead to? Victims of which could be people who do not align with the actions of authorities. You ask a question that we've already discussed and drawn conclusions from and taken steps towards all these years, because the witch hunt in Estonia and in other countries with this ultra-nationalist regime, this witch hunt has been going on for a long time. It's not new. And the work of this commission is unlikely to change anything. We've repeatedly stated that quite severe police regimes are in power in the Baltic countries. And they're very nationalist oriented. They're practically conducting neo-Nazi measures. Russia will continue to provide legal and moral support to compatriots who are facing repression and legal measures. And we will also continue to provide objective information on the human rights situation. This is the scope of our work on providing support. And the second question, thank you. According to several international experts, after the Second World War, it was the creation of the architecture of international institutions that should have allowed countries to solve problems together. But later it turned out that the larger number of organizations did not lead to the greater ability to solve crises, and several international organizations such as European Union, International Monetary Fund, International Olympic Committee could just crumble or reorganize themselves. Against this backdrop, how do you assess the future of BRICS? What is the stability of this situation? Thank you so much. I disagree with the phrasing of these. Different institutions, organizations, and forums are numerous. But they're unable to carry out this work on preserving peace. It's the same as purchasing a car. And while being a driver or using someone else's aid to bring it home without reading the manual, without providing fuel, without fine-tuning any of the devices in the car. And when it's winter, just to add water without the proper anti-freezing liquids. So just press on the gas and then to act surprised that your car is not going anywhere. I'm sorry, but the European Union started as the European Economic Council, and it truly allowed countries of the European continent to join forces that gave tangible results. That's why it was the European Economic Council, without politicizing their work, and they focused on joining financial, economic, personnel, production opportunities, and there were no crises. There were, of course, issues. There were different difficulties, but globally, they were the front runners of solving many issues and preventing entering the impossible crisis.
As soon as they started politicizing, in spite of the ideas that had been embedded in the creation of the European Economic Council, and as soon as they began the non-positive dynamics for the European Economic Community itself, when they stopped focusing on economics, on the humanitarian cooperation, as soon as they focused on their own bonuses, as soon as they started to concentrate on the confrontation rather than competition, that is the moment when the system started to fail. This is manifested by the example of the 1990s and the noughts, and instead of understanding the errors of such ways, they embedded these principles into the European Union with the politically dominant forces, and under the umbrella of NATO, they became the economic division of NATO, essentially. And this was the beginning of the end, the collapse of the original ideas for the establishment of this structure. This resulted in open confrontation on the continent and a great conflict capacity, which later detonated. This is not due to the fact that the organizations themselves were bad. This is due to the fact that the people came to become leaders in these organizations, and they acted in a destructive manner, and many of them were brought there artificially by outside forces in spite of their professional inaptitude. They were still turned into leaders of these structures. They were still taken to the heights of international relations. Their mission was to provoke differences and to create destructive elements inside the European Union. Now they work against the interests of the member states. Now they have unleashed the destruction of the great economic and industrial power that the EU used to have, and now they are moving even further. They compromise on their own energy security. They witness the businesses and the industries flee from the space of the European Union. This is only one example. So please do not think that it was the fault of the mechanism and you were good. No, we should see exactly who made these contributions, who made sure that a number of international institutions stopped functioning properly. And now we see how the West is trying to do the same in the context of, for example, the Asian cooperations on groups that were originally meant for regional development, overcoming poverty and overcoming the conflict capacity and de-escalating the risks, but later, under the influence of the uninvited Western guests, they fell under the destructive influence. At the same time, we see Asia, the Asian economies and the Asian regional players, for now having enough strength not to turn their economic regional cooperation into an arena for political experiments of outside players. This is a different example. Yes, they are facing aggression and pressure, and great pressure is exerted against them. Thank you. Thank you. Do we have any more questions? If not, this will be the end of my briefing for today. Until the next meeting. And as usual, I wish you all the best. Thank you very much. Goodbye.